Before we dive into this chilling story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more real and spine-tingling accounts to life. The morning air was sharp enough to bite, crisp with the scent of pine and day breath. I tightened the straps of my pack and adjusted the brim of my ranger hat as I stepped out onto the trail. The sun had only just begun to climb over the granite cliffs, casting long shadows across the valley. This was my favorite time of day in Yosemite, the quiet hours when the park felt truly alive, not yet crowded with hikers or the hum of passing cars. Just me and the wilderness. My boots crunched against the frost-kissed dirt path as I headed toward one of the less traveled trails near the valley's edge. A light mist clung to the air, swirling lazily in the faint breeze. The solitude here was unlike anything else, and it was why I had taken this job. Out here, I wasn't Matt, the guy who couldn't make it work in the city. I wasn't the guy who spent too many nights staring at a computer screen, feeling like the walls were closing in. Out here, I was just a part of the landscape, one more piece of the puzzle. As I rounded a bend, a chorus of bird calls erupted from a thicket of trees to my left. I paused to listen, trying to identify the species by their songs. Warblers, maybe a raven or two. It reminded me of my first week as a ranger, fumbling through a bird identification guide like a rookie. Now, after 5 years on the job, I could pick out most of them without a second thought. It was one of the small victories that made this life rewarding. A movement up ahead caught my eye, a family of 3, their backpacks bulging with gear, huddled around the map. They looked out of place, like they just walked off a billboard for outdoor apparel. I quickened my pace and called out, "Fording! Everything okay?" The father, a tall man with a weathered baseball cap, turned to me with a sheepish grin. "We're, trying to figure out which way to the lake." I glanced at the map he held, a glossy tourist brochure with trails marked in bold, cheerful colors. "Ah, you're looking for Mirror Lake," I said, tracing the route with my finger. "You'll want to follow this trail for another half-mile, then take the fork to the left. Shouldn't be more than a 40-minute hike from here." "Thanks, Ranger," the man said, visibly relieved. The little boy at his side tugged on his sleeve. "Can we see bears, Dad?" I smiled. "If you're lucky, you might spot one from a distance. Just remember, they're more afraid of you than you are of them. Keep your food secured, and you'll be fine." The boy's eyes lit up, and the family moved on, their voices fading into the trees. I watched them go, a pang of unease settling in my chest. This late in the season, the park was quieter, but that didn't mean it was without risks. I'd heard too many stories of hikers wandering off trail or getting caught unprepared by the weather. That family seemed like the type to underestimate the wilderness. Shaking off the thought, I continued my patrol. The trail climbed steadily, the trees thinning to reveal breathtaking views of the valley below. El Capitan loomed in the distance, its sheer granite face glowing golden in the morning light. I pulled out my radio to check in with the station, but the static hissed back at me. Typical. The signal in these parts was spotty at best. By mid-morning, the sun had warmed the air enough to melt the frost, and I stopped to sip from my canteen. Leaning against a boulder, I took in the scenery. It was moments like this that made the long hours and the occasional run-ins with overconfident hikers worth it. The park was a living, breathing entity, and I was its steward. As I packed up to move on, a peculiar sound reached my ears, a faint rustling, almost rhythmic, coming from deeper in the woods. I froze, listening intently. It could have been an animal, a deer perhaps, but something about it felt off. I scanned the tree line, my pulse quickening. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual mix of towering pines and tangled underbrush. Still, the unease lingered. Probably just the wind, I muttered to myself, though I didn't quite believe it. I adjusted my pack and started back down the trail, my senses heightened now. Every snapping twig or fluttering leaf seemed louder, more urgent. By the time I returned to the station for my lunch break, the uneasy feeling had faded, replaced by the mundane rhythm of my duties. Another day in the park, I told myself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that the wilderness had shifted somehow, its peace disrupted by something unseen, something waiting. The woods had a way of swallowing sound at night. During the day, the park buzzed with life, birds calling, the wind rustling leaves, the occasional crunch of boots on the trail. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a hush settled over Yosemite that made even my steady nerves falter. I adjusted my flashlight, the beam cutting through the encroaching darkness. The trail ahead seemed unremarkable at first, just another stretch of dirt winding through towering pines. But there was something in the air tonight, a weight I couldn't quite explain. It started with a backpack. I almost didn't notice it, half buried under a mound of fallen leaves at the base of a tree. At first, I thought it was a discarded piece of gear, something a hiker had carelessly left behind. But when I crouched down and swept away the leaves, the sight stopped me cold. The fabric was shredded, deep gouges tearing through the nylon like it had been clawed apart by something or someone. The straps were frayed, snapped clean as though they'd been yanked with impossible force. Inside, I found scraps of clothing, a dented water bottle, and what looked like the remnants of a trail map. The map was partially intact, ink smeared by rain or sweat. What caught my attention were the faint markings scrawled in the margins, circles around certain areas of the park, remote areas, places no casual hiker would wander. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. I wasn't alone out here. Calon? My voice sounded smaller than I intended, swallowed by the dense forest. I waited, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my own heartbeat. Nothing answered. The backpack shouldn't have been there. It was too far off the main trail, in a spot most hikers wouldn't venture. I swept the area with my flashlight and noticed something else. A faint trail of footprints leading away from the tree. They were uneven, as if the person had been running or staggering. I followed the tracks, my boots crunching softly on the forest floor. The flashlight beam bobbed ahead, illuminating the way. After about 50 yards, the track stopped abruptly, replaced by a disturbed patch of dirt and leaves. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't ended well. I radioed back to the station. "This is Matt. I found an abandoned backpack on the ridge trail. Looks like it's been torn apart. Might belong to a lost hiker." Static crackled in response before a voice came through, faint but clear. "Copy that, Matt. Any sign of the owner?" "Not yet," I said, my eyes scanning the darkened woods. "I'm following some tracks. They lead off trail. Might want to send someone out here in the morning." "Understood. Be careful out there." I clipped the radio back to my belt, the unease settling deeper into my chest. Something about the backpack felt wrong. It wasn't just the condition it was in. It was the location, the footprints, the strange markings on the map. I moved cautiously now, every step deliberate. The forest seemed darker than usual, the trees pressing in closer. A faint rustling sound made me freeze. It was subtle, just a whisper of movement, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. "Kalong?" I called again, louder this time. The rustling stopped. I swung the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but all I saw were trees and shadows. The forest had gone completely still, like it was holding its breath. I took a step forward and my boot caught on something solid. Looking down, I saw a broken branch, splintered at the end, with dried blood staining the wood. My stomach tightened. This wasn't an ordinary lost hiker. A cold wind swept through the trees, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely afraid in the park I had called home. The flashlight flickered, its beam dimming momentarily before steadying again. I swallowed hard, gripping it tighter as I turned back toward the trail. I had seen enough for tonight, but as I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows. The last traces of daylight slipped behind the granite cliffs, casting the forest in a shadowy stillness that clung to everything like a second skin. My flashlight beam carved a narrow path through the darkness, flickering slightly as if the batteries could sense my unease. I adjusted the strap of my pack and kept moving, following the faint trail of footprints I discovered earlier. They were uneven, as though whoever made them had been stumbling or running. It wasn't long before the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing. My boots crunched on the frost-kissed ground as I approached. At first, I thought it was just another overgrown patch of wilderness, but then I saw it, a campsite hidden beneath a canopy of pines. The setup was meticulous, almost unnervingly so. A tarp stretched tightly between two trees formed a crude shelter, blending seamlessly with the forest. A small fire pit sat cold and unused, its edges lined with carefully placed stones. Whoever had been here knew what they were doing, too well perhaps. I crouched low, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The air was eerily still, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. Slowly, I approached the tarp, my hand instinctively brushing against the radio clip to my belt. Underneath the tarp, I found a scattering of personal belongings that made my stomach tighten. A weathered backpack lay open, its contents spilling out like secrets laid bare. A few protein bars, a small hunting knife, a notebook with a cracked leather cover. I picked up the notebook and flipped it open. The pages were filled with cramped, erratic handwriting, lines crossing over each other in a chaotic mess. Phrases jumped out at me. "They don't see me. The trees are safe. It's not over yet." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to turn the page. The next was even worse, drawings. Dark, crude sketches of human figures twisted into unnatural shapes, their faces obscured or scratched out entirely. My thumb grazed the corner of the page, and I felt a faint stickiness. Blood. I dropped the notebook as though it had burned me, my pulse quickening. A part of me wanted to call it in right then and there, but my curiosity, or maybe my need to understand, kept me rooted to the spot. Next to the pack was a folded map. I unfolded it carefully, the paper crackling in the cold air. Trails staked across it, marking familiar routes through Yosemite, but several areas were circled in red ink. My stomach sank when I realized the circles corresponded to some of the park's most remote, least trafficked areas. This wasn't just someone's hiking plan. It was a map of intent. A sudden rustling snapped me out of my thoughts. My flashlight darted toward the sound, illuminating a cluster of bushes a few yards away. I froze, every muscle in my body coiled tight, waiting. For a moment, the forest held its breath. Then, A squirrel darted out, its tiny form scurrying across the clearing and disappearing into the underbrush. I exhaled slowly, my breath fogging in the chilly air. But something still felt wrong. My instinct screamed that I wasn't alone. The clearing, the campsite, even the forest itself, it all felt staged, like I'd walked into a trap without knowing it. I turned back to the fire pit, crouching to examine it more closely. The ashes were cold, but not old. Whoever had been here hadn't left long ago. A chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. That's when I noticed the item partially buried beneath a pile of leaves near the pit. It was a bandana, dark and stiff with dried blood. My fingers hovered over it, hesitant, before I finally picked it up. As I turned it over in my hand, the weight of the situation hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just some lost camper or survivalist hiding out in the wilderness. This was something far worse. I heard a faint crack, a branch snapping underfoot. The sound was impossibly close. My head whipped around, flashlight beam slicing through the dark, but there was nothing. No one. Just the endless shadows between the trees. My fingers tightened around the radio. I needed to call this in, but as I reached for it, a single thought stopped me cold. What if they're still watching? I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the silence, feeling it press against me like a living thing. Then I took a step back, and another, until I was clear of the tarp and back on the trail. I didn't run. I couldn't risk drawing attention, but my pace quickened with every step. The forest seemed darker now, its shadows deeper, as though it knew something I didn't. When I finally reached the relative safety of the ranger station an hour later, I still couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been followed. And as I sat there, staring at the map spread out before me, the red circles burned into my memory, I realized one terrifying truth. The wilderness wasn't just hiding in, it was helping in. The sun was a pale smudge on the horizon, its last light filtering weakly through the towering pines. The temperature was dropping fast, and the stillness of the woods pressed in on me like a heavy blanket. The radio on my belt crackled faintly, a comforting connection to the world beyond this vast, indifferent wilderness. "Matt, we've got your report," came the voice of my supervisor, Gary, tinny and distant. "It's getting dark. Head back to the station, and we'll check this out first thing in the morning." I glanced at the eerie campsite sprawled before me. The fire pit was cold, but the arrangement of stones around it was unnervingly precise, like it had been set up with ritualistic care. The blood-stained bandana lay crumpled near the edge, its edges stiff and brittle from drying in the open air. Then there was the map, spread out on the ground like an invitation. Its neatly drawn trails and ominously marked excess whispered of something deliberate, something dark. "Understood," I replied into the radio, my voice steady despite the unease coiling in my gut. But I didn't move. Gary was right. Heading back to Saki was the logical thing to do. Yet the idea of walking away, of leaving this untouched until morning, knotted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been here wasn't gone, not completely. There were no fresh tracks leading away from the campsite, no signs of a hurried departure. It felt watched. I crouched down to examine the map again, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam across its surface. The excess were scattered across the trails, some in areas popular with campers, others deep in the backcountry where few ventured. The one closest to me was just a mile or so away, judging by the scale. My fingers brushed the edge of the paper, feeling its damp texture, and I made my decision. "Gary," I said into the radio, forcing calm into my tone. I'm going to take a closer look. There's a marked trail nearby. I'll check it out and report back. There was a pause on the other end, static hissing softly like a whispered warning. Finally, Gary's voice returned, laced with irritation. Don't do anything stupid, Ma. Sunrise isn't that far off. Stay safe. The line went dead, leaving me in silence again. I clicked the radio back onto my belt and stood, adjusting the strap of my pack. The woods around me seemed to grow darker with every passing second, the trees crowding closer together, their branches clawing at the sky. The trail was faint, overgrown with weeds and lined with jagged rocks that caught the soles of my boots. My flashlight illuminated the way, but beyond its narrow beam, the forest seemed to swallow everything whole. The crunch of my footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, masking the subtler sounds of the woods, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, the low hoot of an owl. It was just my imagination, I told myself, but every now and then I had the distinct feeling I wasn't alone. The sensation was maddeningly inconsistent, flaring hot and insistent one moment, fading to nothing the next. I kept moving, my hand resting lightly on the hilt of my utility knife. As I approached the marked spot, the air grew colder, sharper, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The faint outline of something unnatural came into view, a small cairn of stones, stacked with eerie precision in the middle of the trail. I knelt beside it, examining the structure. Each stone was smooth, as if deliberately chosen, and balanced so perfectly that it seemed to defy gravity. A faint metallic smell wafted up from the cairn, and I noticed a dark stain on the topmost stone. Blood. The radio crackled again, startling me. My hand flew to my belt, part hammering. Gary? I asked, my voice tight. But the static continued, broken only by faint, unintelligible whispers. I froze, gripping the radio tighter. The whispers were low, just on the edge of perception, but unmistakably human. I turned slowly, sweeping my flashlight in a wide arc shadows left and danced across the trees, but nothing moved. The whispers stopped as abruptly as they had begun. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Whoever had left the cairn was nearby. I was sure of it now, and they wanted me to know. My instinct screamed at me to retreat, to radio for backup and wait for dawn. But something deeper, something stubborn, kept me rooted to the spot. I wasn't just a ranger. I was a protector of this park, of the people who came here seeking peace and beauty. If there was a threat, I needed to understand it. I straightened and continued past the cairn, following the faint trail further into the darkness. Somewhere ahead, the truth was waiting. The forest had changed. It wasn't the trees. They stood as stoic as ever, towering giants with rough bark and whispering leaves. It wasn't the air either, though it felt heavier now, like it carried a secret it couldn't quite contain. No, it was something else, something unspoken that prickled the back of my neck and set my instincts humming like a live wire. I had followed the map for hours, venturing deeper into Yosemite's lesser-trodden trails. By now, the sun had long surrendered to the horizon, leaving only a faint smear of light behind the mountains. My flashlight beam sliced through the encroaching dark, revealing patches of trail ahead. The ground crunched under my boots, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. That's when I noticed it, something subtle, but wrong. The trail wasn't pristine anymore. Broken twigs, scattered leaves, and footprints marred the path. Not the kind of prints left by a casual hiker, but deliberate ones, heavy and erratic, as if the person had been pacing back and forth. I crouched low, shining my light at the impressions. The size was unmistakably a man's, the deep indentation suggesting he was carrying something heavy, or someone. I straightened, scanning the trees around me. Shadows pulled between the trunks, shifting as my flashlight moved. The hair on my arms rose. I was being watched. I couldn't see him, but he was out there. I knew it. And he wanted me to feel his presence. My radio crackled at my hip, startling me. I fumbled for it, pressing it to my mouth. "Base, this is Ranger Matt. I found signs, footprints. Someone's been here recently." My voice sounded steadier than I felt, though my pulse was drumming in my ears. The radio hissed, a scratchy static filling the silence. No response. Not even the comforting hum of an open channel. "Base, come in." Static again. And then, just for a split second, a faint noise, a low guttural chuckle, too faint to be sure if it was real or imagined. I froze, staring at the device. "Kalong?" I said, louder this time, as if raising my voice could will someone, anyone to answer. Nothing. I shoved the radio back into its holster, my unease growing into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I pushed on, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The trail twisted and dipped, leading me into a shallow ravine. Here, the trees closed in tighter, their skeletal branches weaving into a canopy that blocked out the faint starlight above. The air felt different here, colder, damper, like I'd stepped into a pocket of time forgotten by the world. Then I saw it, a crude snare strung between two trees. It was a simple trap, but deadly if I hadn't been paying attention. A thin wire glinted in my flashlight beam, rigged to snap taut at ankle height. I crouched, examining it closer. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing. The wire was expertly hidden beneath a scattering of leaves and dirt, nearly invisible to the untrained eye. My stomach churned. This wasn't the work of a poacher or some overzealous camper. This was deliberate, designed to maim. The forest seemed to press it around me, its silence now deafening. I turned in slow, deliberate circles, shining my light in every direction. The beam caught another glint, this time higher up. A thin thread, almost like fishing line, strung taut between two branches. It stretched across the trail in neck height. A growl of frustration bubbled in my throat. This was no longer just an investigation. This was a game, and I had walked straight into it. My flashlight flickered. Once, twice, and then the beam steadied. I smacked it against my thigh, my grip tightening. It wasn't the time for faulty gear. Not out here, not now. That's when I heard it, a faint rustle, like a footstep brushing against fallen leaves. My breath caught, and I swung the flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing nothing but trees and undergrowth. "Who's there?" I called, my voice echoing back to me. "This is Ranger Matt. If you're out here, you need to make yourself known." Silence. The kind of silence that wasn't natural. The kind that made your ears strain for something, anything, to break it. Then, another sound. A low, deliberate scrape, like metal dragging against bark. It came from ahead, just out of sight. I stepped forward cautiously, every muscle in my body taut. My flashlight swept the trees, and that's when I saw it, a mark etched deep into the bark of a massive pine. The words were crude, but unmistakable. "We're not alone." My breath hitched, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, but I forced myself to stay. My job was to protect this park and anyone in it. even if that meant putting myself in harm's way. The scrape came again, louder this time. Closer. I gripped my flashlight tighter and pressed forward, ignoring the voice in the back of my head telling me I was making a mistake. Whatever was out here, whoever was out here, they wanted me to be afraid. But I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Not yet. The air was colder than I expected, and the weight of the silence pressed against me like the night itself was conspiring to keep secrets. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the towering pines, illuminating only the immediate path ahead. Every crunch of my boots on the dry leaves sounded too loud, like the forest was amplifying my presence. I was a foreigner here, no longer a ranger, but a trespasser in someone else's domain. That someone was watching. I could feel it. I adjusted my grip on the radio at my hip, though I hadn't used it since finding the hidden campsite hours ago. The voice of my supervisor had been clear. Wait until morning for backup. But I couldn't. The campsite had been too deliberate, too staged. The blood-stained bandana wasn't just evidence. It was a message. And the journal with its cryptic scrawls about cleansing the wild of intruders painted a picture I couldn't ignore. Someone was out here, and they wanted me to know it. The trail ahead forked. The map from the campsite now crumpled in my pocket, offering little clarity. I took the left path, drawn by a faint sound. A distant rustling, maybe? Or just the wind threading its way through the trees? I told myself it was nothing, but the tightening in my chest said otherwise. Then I saw it, a single tree standing apart from the rest, its bark pale under the beam of my flashlight. There was something carved into it. I stepped closer, my breath hitching as the words came into focus. "We're not alone." I froze. The carving was fresh, the edges of the letters rough and jagged, as though they had been scratched into the bark with a blade not too long ago. The words weren't a warning, they were a promise. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I scanned the woods around me. The beam sliced through the darkness, bouncing on shadows that seemed to move just out of reach. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. The words hung in the air, unanswered, until they dissolved into the cold night. And then came the static. The radio on my hip hissed to life, crackling like the sound of dry leaves underfoot. At first, I thought it might be my supervisor trying to reach me, but as I grabbed it, the static grew louder, sharper. It was a random noise. Beneath it, faint and almost imperceptible, was the sound of whispering. I brought the radio closer to my ear, straining to make out the words. "Out here!" I stiffened, my heart hammering against my ribs. Watching, it wasn't my supervisor. The voice was low and breathy, coiled with malice. The whispering cut off abruptly, replaced by a single tone, a steady, high-pitched beat that sent shivers crawling up my spine. I dropped the radio like it had burned me and stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight jerking wildly across the forest floor. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. Not yet. Running would mean giving in, and I didn't know who or what I was up against. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Whoever was doing this wanted me scared, wanted me to second-guess myself. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I took a cautious step forward, then another. My eyes flicked back to the tree and its carved message. That's when I saw the second mark, lower, almost hidden by the uneven light of my flashlight. It wasn't a word this time. It was a symbol, a crude X with a circle drawn around it. A target. The message was clear. I was being hunted. A faint rustle to my left snapped me out of my trance. My head whipped toward the sound, but the flashlight revealed only empty woods. Still, I knew better. Empty didn't mean safe. Gripping the radio again, I keyed the mic, trying to steady my voice. "This is Ranger Matt. I need backup. Suspected trespasser in the southern quadrant near Trailhead 7. Possible hostile." The response was instant static, followed by silence. My request had been swallowed by the void, leaving me with the unnerving thought that my signal wasn't reaching anyone. Or worse, someone was interfering. The forest closed in around me, the shadows thicker now, more oppressive. My rational mind screamed to retreat, to return to the ranger station and wait for morning. But something deeper, something primal, urged me to press on. If I turned back now, I'd be abandoning the truth, and possibly leaving others in harm's way. As I turned to follow the trail, my flashlight caught a fleeting movement. A shadow too quick, too deliberate to be the wind. My pulse spiked as I swung the beam toward it, but nothing was there. "Show yourself," I barked, my voice cracking despite my effort to sound commanding. The only reply was the echo of my own words. I didn't sleep that night. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I was back at the hidden campsite, staring at the map again. The marked trails seemed to pulse with new menace, each one leading deeper into the wilderness. I didn't know who or what I was dealing with, but I knew one thing for certain: they were still out there, and they weren't finished with me yet. The moon hung low in the sky, its light fractured by the skeletal branches of towering pines. The silence of Yosemite was no longer comforting. It was oppressive, a vacuum where every sound felt magnified and unnatural. My boots crunched against the undergrowth as I moved cautiously, scanning the shadows for movement. My heart thudded heavily, each beat a reminder of how alive I was, and how precarious that state had become. I had just left the cursed message on the tree behind me: "You're not alone." The jagged letters carved into the bark weren't just a warning, they were a promise. Someone was out here, watching, hunting. I gripped the flashlight tighter, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness. The light quivered as my hand trembled. I forced myself to steady it. Panicking now would only give me chill. I had seen what this man was capable of: the traps, the deliberate placement of clues. This wasn't a random madman. This was someone who thrived on control and precision. And now, I was his quarry. The first hint that I wasn't alone came as a whisper of movement, so faint I almost dismissed it as wind through the trees. But there was no breeze. The air was still and cold. My pulse quickened as I crouched low, scanning the area with my flashlight. Nothing. Just trees and shadows, each one stretching and contorting like the gnarled fingers of some slumbering giant. Then, another sound, this time unmistakable. A soft snap of a twig, no more than 20 feet away. I extinguished the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. My breaths were shallow, my ears straining for any hint of movement. My mind raced. He was close, too close. I couldn't see him, but he could see me. I needed to even the playing field. I took a cautious step backward, careful not to disturb the brittle leaves underfoot. My fingers brushed against the bark of a tree, grounding me in the moment. Slowly, I slid my hand to the hunting knife on my belt. Its weight was reassuring, though I knew it was no match for a rifle or a well-laid trap. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. I stayed still, blending into the night as best I could. My muscles ached from the tension, but I didn't dare move. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement to my right. Just a shadow, but enough to confirm I wasn't imagining things. He was circling me, My mind screamed for me to run, but I knew better. Running would only make me an easier target. Instead, I moved slowly, deliberately, keeping the tree at my back. I needed to stay unpredictable, to make myself harder to pin down. My thoughts churned as I tried to anticipate his next move. He had the advantage. This was his game. But I knew this park like the back of my hand, and I wasn't about to let him turn it into my graveyard. A rustling to my left made me pivot, knife at the ready. Nothing. Then to my right, another sound. He was toying with me, trying to rattle me into making a mistake. My grip on the knife tightened. If he wanted to draw me out, he'd have to try harder. I took a calculated risk, turning the flashlight on briefly to blind him if he was close. The beam sliced through the night, catching the faintest glint of something metallic, a rifle barrel. My heart dropped. I flicked the light off immediately and ducked low, moving quickly and quietly toward a cluster of boulders a few yards away. Adrenaline surged through me as I reached the rocks and pressed my back against the largest one. My breath came fast and shallow, misting in the frigid air. I was hidden, for now, but I knew it wouldn't last. He was patient, calculated, and I was running out of options. The next sound wasn't subtle. A sharp crack, followed by the unmistakable thud of a bullet embedding itself in a tree near where I had just been standing. The report echoed through the forest, shattering the stillness. My instinct screamed at me to move, and I darted to the side, keeping low and using the terrain for cover. My mind raced. He had a rifle, but he wasn't shooting to kill. Not yet. He was aiming to disorient, to hurt me where he wanted me. I forced myself to focus, to push past the fear clawing at the edges of my mind. I needed to think like him, to anticipate his moves. He wanted to corner me, to trap me like the others. But I wouldn't let him. This was my park, my home. If he thought he could outweigh me here, he was wrong. I moved carefully through the underbrush, circling wide to throw him off. The terrain grew steeper, the air colder as I climbed toward higher ground. My breath burned in my chest, but I kept going, my senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of shadows felt like a threat. I couldn't afford to let my guard down. Then I heard it, the low, deliberate sound of footsteps. Slow, measured. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. He was confident, sure of his control. But he hadn't counted on one thing. I wasn't just running blindly. I was leading him, pulling him toward a section of the park I knew like the back of my hand, the ravine. The chase was far from over, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. He thought he was hunting me, but he didn't realize I was setting a trap of my own. And when the moment came, I would be ready. The forest was an all-consuming void. The further I trekked, the more I became aware of how utterly alone I was, or how utterly not alone I might be. The beam of my flashlight carved through the thick, damp darkness, illuminating only fleeting snapshots of the world around me. A jagged rock, a twisted tree root, the glint of frost on the grass. Everything else dissolved into the suffocating black. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a towering sequoia. The air was cold enough to burn my lungs, and the silence was louder than anything I'd ever heard. Not even the nocturnal chorus of crickets or owls broke the quiet. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried the radio again, even though I already knew what I'd hear. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Matt. Do you copy?" "Over." Static, just like before. The crackle of empty air mocked me, reminding me how far out I was. The map I'd taken from the hidden campsite was folded in my jacket pocket, the paper worn and brittle under my fingers. I pulled it out and shone my flashlight over it. John had marked several trails, each one leading deeper into the most isolated parts of Yosemite. I was heading toward the closest one, a trail that hadn't been used in years. According to the map, it led to an old ranger station, abandoned decades ago. Why had John marked it? Was he using it as a hideout? Or was it just another breadcrumb? Another way to pull me further into his web? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. What if I'm walking straight into a trap? I shoved the map back into my pocket, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. My flashlight flickered, and for a heart-stopping moment, the darkness surged around me like a living thing. I slapped the side of the flashlight, and the beam steadied, but the brief loss of light was enough to set my nerves on edge. I scanned the trees around me, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the endless rows of towering pines and the oppressive weight of the night. I kept moving, each step heavier than the last. My boots crunched against the frozen dirt, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a faint rustle, a snap of a twig, but when I stopped to listen, there was nothing. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The terrain grew steeper, the trail winding upward into the hills. My legs ached, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The cold bit at my face and hands, and I regretted not bringing thicker gloves. I wasn't dressed for a long night hike like this. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, another trick of the light. But as I drew closer, I realized it was a structure, a small, dilapidated cabin tucked between the trees. The ranger station. The roof sagged under the weight of years, and the windows were dark and lifeless. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I approached cautiously, my flashlight sweeping across the building. The door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. The interior was pitch black, and the silence seemed to deepen as I stepped closer. I reached for my sidearm, my hand trembling slightly as I unholstered it. "John?" My voice cracked in the stillness. No response. I pushed the door open with the barrel of my gun, though it groaning loudly in protest. The stench hit me immediately, a sickly sweet odor that turned my stomach. The beam of my flashlight revealed the source. A dead animal, a deer, sprawled in the corner. Its body was mangled, the flesh torn apart in a way that didn't seem entirely natural. And then I saw the writing. Scrawled across the walls in what looked like charcoal, maybe something darker, were words. Sentences. Fragments of thoughts. "They don't see me. I am everywhere. No escape." The handwriting was jagged and frantic, as if the writer's mind was unraveling with every stroke. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed out of the cabin, my flashlight swinging wildly across the woods. That's when I heard it, a low, deliberate crunch. A footstep. I froze. It came again, closer this time. I turned toward the sound, but all I could see was darkness. "Who's there?" My voice wavered, the bravado I clung to all night slipping away. Silence. And then, just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam, I saw it. A figure. A man, standing perfectly still among the trees. John. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me. Even from a distance, I could feel the weight of his gaze, like a predator sizing up its prey. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other, the forest around us holding its breath. And then, without a sound, he melted back into the shadows. Gone. The air rushed back into my lungs, and I stumbled backward, my hand shaking so violently I could barely keep hold of the flashlight. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the frozen earth. I didn't stop until I was far from the cabin, far from the spot where John had stood. But no matter how far I ran, the feeling stayed with me, the feeling that I was being watched. Because I was. The night wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, heavy and unrelenting. The air was sharp with the smell of pine and damp earth, but every breath carried the faint, acrid tang of fear. I crouched on a moss-covered boulder, the dim light of my headlamp casting long, wavering shadows against the jagged rock walls of the trail. My heart pounded, a drumbeat in the oppressive silence. I wasn't sure if it was adrenaline or the knowledge that he was out there, watching, waiting. The map I'd found earlier was spread out on my knee, illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight. Each red-marked trail felt like a noose tightening around my throat. John had mapped this wilderness as though he owned it, his trails weaving through the heart of Yosemite like veins through a body. I traced one of the lines with my finger, leading to a dead-end ravine nestled deep in the park's wilderness. That's where I'd make my stand. I knew this park like the back of my hand, every ridge, every hidden stream, every deceptive patch of brush. John may have been a predator, but this was my territory. I folded the map and stuffed it into my pocket, the paper crinkling with finality. This wasn't about courage anymore. It was survival. The hike to the ravine was grueling. The weight of the supplies in my pack, rope, a knife, and a flare gun, dug into my shoulders with every step. The cold bit into my exposed skin, but the burn in my legs was a welcome distraction from the gnawing fear in the back of my mind. My flashlight flickered, and I smacked it against my palm, cursing under my breath. Every rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. A branch snapped in the distance, and I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife on my belt. I listened, straining to hear beyond the deafening thud of my heartbeat. But the sound didn't come again. He was out there. I could feel it. The ravine opened before me like a gaping wound in the earth. The sheer walls rose on either side, their jagged edges clawing at the night sky. A narrow stream trickled through the center, its surface glinting like molten silver in the moonlight. This place was both my sanctuary and my trap. I set to work immediately, my fingers numb with cold, as I rigged a tripwire across the entrance to the ravine. It was rudimentary, but it would slow him down, maybe give me a few precious seconds to act. I climbed to a narrow ledge overlooking the area, my boots slipping on the loose gravel. From this vantage point, I had a clear view of the ravine floor below, a perfect place to ambush him. The hours stretched endlessly. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual symphony of crickets and owls replaced by an unsettling silence. I forced myself to stay alert, my knife resting in my palm. My mind replayed every moment that had led me here. The abandoned campsite, the bloodied bandana, the journal with its cryptic ramblings. John wasn't just hiding. He was hunting. A sound broke through the stillness, faint but deliberate. Footsteps, crunching softly against the gravel trail. My pulse quickened, and I pressed myself against the cold rock wall, my breath shallow in control. The steps grew louder, each one measured, as though he wanted me to know he was coming. And then I saw him, a shadowy figure emerged from the tree line, his silhouette distorted by the faint glow of the moon. He moved with an unnerving calm, his head turning slowly, as he surveyed the area. He was tall, lean, and carried himself with a predator's grace. My stomach churned as I watched him step closer to the tripwire. I gripped my knife tighter, the cold metal digging into my palm. My plan was simple: use the wire to disorient him, then take him down. But as he approached the trap, he paused, his head tilting as though he sensed something was off. "Smart," I muttered under my breath. John crouched, examining the ground. My heart sank as he spotted the tripwire, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He reached down, deftly dismantling it with a casual confidence that made my skin crawl. This was my moment. I drew a deep breath and aimed the flare gun at the rock face above him. The shot echoed like a gunshot, the flare bursting in a brilliant red flash that lit up the ravine. The rocks loosened, tumbling down in a thunderous landslide. John dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the worst of it, but the chaos was enough to throw him off balance. I leapt from the ledge, landing hard on the ravine floor. Pain shot through my knees, but I forced myself to stand, the knife gleaming in my hand. John was already on his feet, his eyes cold and calculating. For the first time, I saw him clearly. His face was gone, his eyes sharp and predatory. He didn't look afraid, he looked amused. "Well," he said, his voice low and calm, "this should be interesting." The sound of his voice sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't a man. He was something darker, something primal. The confrontation was inevitable now. There was no going back. The moon was high, casting pale light over the granite cliffs and skeletal branches of Yosemite's forgotten trails. My breath came in short, visible puffs as I crouched behind a boulder, the night cold and heavy around me. Every rustle of the wind through the trees sounded amplified, sharp, as if the park itself held its breath, waiting for what was to come. I wasn't alone. I knew it. The signs had been there all night, the deliberate traps, the faint whispers over my radio, the scratches on the trees. I tried to stay one step ahead, but John, whoever he really was, had been hunting me just as I'd been hunting him. Then I heard it, a twig snapping, deliberate and close. My fingers tightened around the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. I'd long abandoned my sidearm earlier that day when I crossed a shallow creek. The holster had gotten soaked and the gun jammed. Now, I had nothing but raw instinct and the blade. "Matt," a voice called out, low and conversational. My heart dropped. It wasn't a yell or a scream, but a calm, calculated tone, as if we were old friends catching up. The sound drifted through the woods, bouncing off the cliffs, making it impossible to pinpoint its origin. I stayed still, forcing myself to breathe quietly, even as adrenaline threatened to take over. "I know you can hear me," he continued. "You're good, I'll give you that. Most don't make it this far." The voice came closer, still too casual to assure. I risked a glance over the edge of the boulder, scanning the darkness. My flashlight stayed off. I couldn't risk being seen. Instead, my eyes adjusted to the moonlight, picking out the faint shapes of trees, the jagged rocks, and then movement. There he was, a tall, wiry figure emerged from the shadows, his outline blending into the night. He wore a dark jacket, and though I couldn't see his face clearly, I felt his eyes scanning the area, searching for me. He held something long in his hand, maybe a crowbar or a machete. It glinted faintly in the moonlight. "You know," he said, his voice like gravel, "people always think they're safe in places like this. Wide open spaces, fresh air, no walls to trap them. But out here, you're more exposed than you've ever been. I stayed frozen, my muscles screaming at me to move, to run, but my mind kept me rooted. He was trying to bait me, flush me out, and I couldn't afford to fall for it. Not yet. I've been watching you, John continued, circling closer. You're not like the others. Most scream, most beg. But you're different. Smart, calm. I respect that. The words sent a chill down my spine. How long had he been watching me? Days? Weeks? Had he seen me on my patrols, spoken to me as just another hiker, blending in with the crowds? The thought made my skin crawl. He stopped suddenly, about 20 feet away from my hiding spot, and crouched, his weapon resting casually across his knees. But you've got one problem, Matt, he said, almost kindly. You think you're in control. You're not. My grip on the knife tightened. The urge to lunge, to end this here and now, surged through me, but something about his tone stopped me. He wanted me to react. He was waiting for it. That little camp you found? He said, standing again and pacing slowly. It wasn't for me. It was for you. A little breadcrumb trail, just for you to follow. And you walked right into it. My blood ran cold. He planned this. Every step, every clue was deliberate. I wasn't the hunter, I was the prey. Why? I forced the word out before I could stop myself. My voice sounded shaky, foreign in the stillness. John froze. For a moment, the woods were silent. Then he turned toward the boulder, his face finally visible in the moonlight. His features were sharp, angular, but what struck me were his eyes, dark, piercing, and utterly devoid of anything human. Why not? He said simply, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. Before I could react, he threw something, small, metallic, and fast. It clattered against the rock near my head, and I ducked instinctively, the sound reverberating in my ears. A distraction. He was moving now, fast and silent, circling like a predator closing in. I had no choice. I bolted for my hiding spot, my boots crunching against the loose dirt and leaves. My flashlight clicked on, the beam cutting through the dark. I swung it wildly, scanning for him, but he was gone. Then his voice came again, this time from my right. Run all you want, Matt. There's nowhere to go. I didn't respond. My mind raced as I navigated the uneven terrain, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I needed higher ground, a vantage point, something to give me an advantage. Ahead, a steep incline rose toward a cluster of rocks. It was risky, but it was my best shot. As I scrambled up the incline, I heard him behind me, his footsteps deliberate, unhurried. He wasn't chasing me. He was hurting me. By the time I reached the top, my lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. I turned, knife raised, scanning the shadows below. The flashlight's beam caught movement, and there he was, standing at the base of the incline, staring up at me. Nice try, he said, his voice echoing. But you're not going to make it out of here. For the first time, I saw him clearly. The weapon in his hand was a machete, the blade chipped and stained. His expression was calm, almost amused, as if he already knew how this would end. But he didn't know me. Not yet. I tightened my grip on the knife and prepared for what was to come. The darkness of Yosemite at night is different from anything else. It doesn't just surround you, it presses against you, making every shadow stretch impossibly long. every sound amplified in the stillness. I could hear my own pulse in my ears as I crouched low behind a boulder near the edge of the ravine. The chill of the ground seeped through my pants, but I didn't dare move. Not yet. The plan was simple, at least in theory. John had been following me for hours, his presence as sure as the moonlight cutting through the trees. I doubled back on the trail and slipped into the ravine, a narrow, treacherous crevice flanked by jagged walls and loose rock. The only way I was through, or up, if you were desperate and foolish enough to try scaling the slick granite walls. I'd left a clear trail for him to follow. Broken twigs, deliberate scuff marks in the dirt, even a torn piece of my jacket snagged on a low branch. I wanted him to think I was panicking, running blind. That's how predators like him thrive, on fear. But this wasn't just his hunt anymore. It was mine too. The faint crunch of leaves reached my ears, and I froze. He was close, maybe 50 yards behind me, moving deliberately. His steps were steady, calculated. He wasn't rushing. No, John was enjoying this. A game to him, but survival for me. I gripped the knife in my hand, the blade catching a faint glimmer of moonlight. It wasn't much, just a standard issue from the Ranger supply kit, but it would have to do. My breath slowed, my heart a hammer in my chest. I had to time this perfectly. One mistake, one misstep, and I'd be the one sprawled lifeless on the forest floor. The sound of footsteps stopped. My stomach tightened. He was close now, too close. I couldn't see him yet, but I felt him, that oppressive, predatory aura wrapping around me like a noose. And then, his voice cut through the silence, low and mocking. "You think you're clever, Matt?" he called out, his tone almost conversational. "Leading breadcrumbs for me to follow? You're not the first one to try something like this, you know. They never get far." I didn't respond. My grip on the knife tightened until my knuckles ached. Silence was my weapon now, and I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of hearing my voice, of knowing he was in my head. He wanted to rattle me. I wouldn't let him. John's footsteps resumed, closer this time. The crunch of boots on gravel echoed faintly off the ravine walls. He was heading right into the trap. My trap. And then I saw him. He moved like a shadow, his silhouette blending with the jagged rocks and the sparse moonlight filtering through the trees. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his figure imposing even from a distance. He carried something in his hand, something that glinted in the pale light. A knife, longer than mine, its blade catching the faint glow of the moon. His face, partially obscured by a hood, was a mask of calm menace. He didn't look like a man who doubted himself. He looked like a man who had done this before. I waited until he was almost at the edge of the ravine, where the loose rocks would betray him. My fingers trembled slightly as I shifted my weight, preparing to spring. And then I threw the rock. It was small, but it clattered loudly as it bounced off the wall opposite me, the sound ricocheting in the narrow space. John spun toward the noise, his body tensing. For the first time, he looked unsure. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the shadows. That was my moment. I lunged for my hiding spot, aiming low, my knife flashing in the dim light. The element of surprise was my only advantage, and I used it ruthlessly. My blade slashed across his thigh, not deep enough to incapacitate but enough to stagger him. He let out a guttural snarl, more anger than pain, and swung his own knife wildly. I ducked, the blade slicing the air inches from my head. Adrenaline surged through me as I scrambled back, putting distance between us. He recovered quickly, too quickly, his movements fluid despite the injury. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw the raw intensity in them, a mix of fury and exhilaration. "You got some fight in you," he said, his voice a low growl. "Good. Makes this more fun." He lunged, and I dodged, the uneven terrain working in my favor. The loose rocks betrayed him, his footing slipping as he tried to follow my movements. I used the moment to strike again, this time aiming for his arm. My knife bit into his flesh, and he cursed, the sound echoing in the confined space. But he was relentless. His strength, his sheer presence, was overwhelming. Each time I thought I had an opening, he was there, countering, adapting. This wasn't just a game to him, it was art, and I was his canvas. I led him deeper into the ravine, where the walls narrowed further. His movements became more constrained, his size working against him. My plan was working, but I was running out of time. My breath came in ragged gasps, my muscles burning with effort. I couldn't keep this up forever. John charged again, his knife slashing toward my chest. I twisted at the last second, the blade grazing my shoulder instead of finding its mark. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but I didn't let it slow me. I swung my knife upward, catching him under the ribs. He staggered, his breath hitching. Blood darkened his shirt, spreading in a slow, ominous bloom. For a moment, he looked down at the wound, almost as if surprised. Then his gaze snapped back to me, and the raw hatred in his eyes made my stomach twist. "You think this ends here?" he rasped, his voice rough, but still laced with menace. "You don't know where you started." He collapsed to one knee, his knife slipping from his hand and clattering onto the rocks. I stood there, just heaving, my knife still clenched tightly in my hand. My legs felt like they might give out, but I didn't dare let my guard down. Not yet. The sound of my own breathing filled the silence as I stared down at him, blood dripping from the blade in my hand. For the first time, John looked small, diminished. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. Not yet. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves as I crouched in the shadows of the ravine. My breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, every inhale scraping against the icy air. Somewhere above me, John prowled like a predator savoring the final moments before the kill. My hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The silence around us was unnatural, as if even the forest had stopped to witness this deadly game. I clutched the makeshift weapon I'd fashioned, a thick branch sharpened to a crude point. It felt pitifully inadequate against the knife John carried, but it was all I had. The world had shrunk to the confines of his ravine, every sound amplified and every shadow a potential threat. I didn't know where he was exactly, but I knew he was close. Too close. A faint rustle to my left snapped my head around. I held my breath, muscles coiled like a spring, ready to react. The sound came again, deliberate and mocking. He was toying with me, forcing me to play into his hands. My fingers tightened around the branch, the rough bark digging into my skin. "Not," his voice drawled, echoing out the stone walls. It was calm, almost conversational, and that made it all the more terrifying. "You've put up quite the fight. I'll give you that." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat was dry, my voice stolen by the sheer weight of fear pressing down on me. I stayed low, hoping the darkness would hide me, though I knew it was only a matter of time before he found me. "You know," he continued, his footsteps crunching on the loose gravel above, "most people don't last this long. They panic. They run. And that's when they make mistakes. But you're different. I shifted ever so slightly, moving deeper into the shadows. The sound of my boots on the ground felt deafening, but I couldn't stay still. Not when he was so close. A sudden thud above me set a cascade of pebbles tumbling down the ravine wall. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, a drumbeat of terror that I was certain he could hear. Then, like a shadow given life, he appeared at the edge of the ravine. The knife in his hand glinted faintly in the moonlight, a sliver of silver against the darkness. His face was calm, his expression almost serene, but his eyes were wild, alive with the thrill of the hunt. "There you are," he said softly. I didn't wait for him to make the first move. With a guttural cry, I lunged, driving the sharpened branch upward with every ounce of strength I had. He moved fast, faster than I anticipated. His arm swung, the blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. I'd barely dodged in time, the knife grazing my arm and sending a hot streak of pain shooting through me. We collided, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The branch fell from my grasp as we tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs. He was stronger than I'd expected, his hands like iron as he tried to pin me down. I thrashed, fighting with a desperation I didn't know I possessed. My fingers clawed at the dirt, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. His knife flashed again, and I twisted, feeling the blade skim past my ribs. It was too close, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. My hand closed around a jagged rock, and without thinking, I swung it upward. The impact was sickening, the sound of bone cracking loud in the stillness. John let out a sharp grunt, his grip on me loosening just enough for me to shove him off. I scrambled to my feet, breathing hard, blood seeping from the wound on my arm. He was already recovering, shaking off the blow like it was nothing. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of pure rage. "You're making this fun," he snarled. He lunged, and I barely managed to sidestep. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, falling hard onto the cold ground. He was on me in an instant, his hands closing around my throat. Stars danced in my vision as I struggled against his weight, my lungs burning for air. In a final, desperate move, I grabbed the branch again and drove it upward with all my strength. It found its mark, sinking into his side. He let out a guttural scream, his grip faltering as he staggered back. I gasped for air, my vision clearing just in time to see him clutching the branch, blood seeping to his fingers. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was his labored breathing and the distant rustle of leaves. Then, with a final, hate-filled layer, he stumbled backward and collapsed into the dirt. I stayed where I was, too stunned and too exhausted to move. My entire body ached, my hands sticky with blood, his and mine. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I needed to call for help, but all I could do was sit there, staring at the man who had nearly taken everything from me. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the ravine in muted golds and grays. The hunt was over, but I knew the scars it left behind would never truly fade. Dawn clawed its way over the granite cliffs, spilling a dull, gray light into the ravine. The air was sharp and biting, every breath feeling like shards of ice in my lungs. My body ached, bruised and battered from the fight, but it was the silence that unnerved me most. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the wilderness I had come to love. It was the kind of silence that followed something terrible, something unnatural. John lay a few feet away, sprawled across the cold air. Blood seeped from a deep gash on his leg where my blade had struck true, staining the ground in dark, arterial pools. His eyes, though half-lidded and dulled by pain, still held that unsettling glint of defiance. He was alive, barely, but I didn't dare move closer. Not yet. I fumbled for the radio clip to my belt, fingers trembling as I pressed the button. Static hissed, an ugly sound began the oppressive stillness. "Base, this is Ranger Matt. Do you copy?" My voice cracked, dry and hoarse. I swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "Emergency in Sector 12. I need backup, immediate backup. Suspecting custody. Repeat, suspecting custody. Injuries reported." The response didn't come right away, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I'd slipped too far off the grid for the signal to carry. Then, the blessed crackle of a reply broke through. "Ranger Matt, this is base. We copy. What's your status?" "Over." I exhaled, relief flooding my chest. "Suspect is down. Injured but alive. I sustained minor injuries, nothing critical. Request immediate medical and law enforcement support. Coordinates." I paused, glancing at the GPS clip to my vest. 37.772 north, 119.669 west. Over. There was a pause on the other end, then a reply. "Roger that, Matt. Units on Brown. EGA 25 minutes. Hold tight. Hold tight." Easier said than done. My hands were still shaking, adrenaline whirring with exhaustion. I let the radio fall to my side, the static fading into the morning air. 25 minutes. Just 25 minutes. But in that moment, 25 minutes felt like an eternity. I turned my gaze back to John. He hadn't moved, but his eyes tracked me, dark and piercing. A shiver ran down my spine. Even in his weakened state, he radiated danger, like a wounded predator still capable of striking. "You're lucky," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. "Could have left you here to bleed out." John chuckled, a low, rasping sound that sent a chill through me. "Lucky?" His voice was weak but laced with venom. "You think this is over, Ranger?" I didn't respond. I didn't trust myself to. Instead, I focused on keeping my breathing steady, keeping my distance. John's smile twisted, a grotesque mockery of amusement. "You don't get it, do you? It's not about me. I'm just a piece. A shadow in the valley." He coughed, a wet, gurgling sound, but the madness in his eyes never wavered. "You'll see. This place, it doesn't belong to you." I tightened my grip on the knife still in my hand. I hadn't even realized I was still holding it, the blade slick with blood and trembling. My instinct screamed at me to silence him, to put an end to the menace he represented. But the rational part of me, the part that wore the uniform and swore to uphold the law, held firm. Instead, I crouched a few feet away, my eyes locked on his. "You're done, John. They'll lock you away. Whatever power trip you think you're on, it ends here." His grin widened, teeth red with blood. "You really believe that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The minutes dragged, each one marked by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional distant bird call, and the labored wheezing of John's breaths. I checked my watch obsessively, counting down the seconds until backup would arrive. The weight of the wilderness pressed down on me, every shadow between the trees seeming to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. Finally, the faint hum of engines broke through the stillness. A convoy of vehicles appeared on the horizon, their headlights cutting through the mist like beacons of salvation. Relief surged through me as I stood, waving to signal my location. Within moments, a team of rangers and law enforcement descended into the ravine. They moved with precision, securing John and administering first aid while another ranger checked me over. I barely registered their words, the adrenaline fading and leaving me hollow. As they carried John away, his head lolled to the side, and for a brief second, our eyes met again. That same chilling glint of defiance burned in his gaze, even as his body was broken and bound. "You will see," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's not over." I stood there, watching the vehicles disappear into the distance, the weight of his words settling like a stone in my gut. The park was quiet again, the stillness returning, but it no longer felt like peace. It felt like something waiting, lurking, just out of sight. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I'd ever feel truly safe here again. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and frost as I stood at the edge of the ravine. My radio crackled with distant voices, each syllable tethering me back to reality. The sun had finally broken over the peaks, its light bleeding through the trees, soft and golden, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded hours earlier. John was gone, hauled off by the authorities, his face pale, but still carrying the unnerving smirk. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt hollow. The wilderness around me seemed unchanged, oblivious to the darkness it had hosted. The towering sequoias stood silent, their massive trunks steady and eternal, as though they had borne witness to countless horrors and simply absorbed them into their endless rings. The birds, which had fallen eerily quiet during the night, began to chirp again, their songs punctuating the emptiness I carried. It was almost as if the forest itself had sighed, letting go of the tension that had wrapped it so tightly. But I couldn't let go. Not yet. I walked back toward the ranger station, my legs aching with every step. Each breath I took felt heavier than the last, as though the air carried the weight of all the souls John had stolen. The evidence left at his hidden campsite was enough to confirm what we already knew. He had been here for months, maybe longer. The map, the trinkets from his victims, the traps, everything pointed to a man who had treated this sacred place as his personal hunting ground. I passed by a clearing where I had helped a family just days ago. I could almost see their faces, hear their laughter as their kids ran through the underbrush. My stomach churned. If I hadn't found John's trail when I did, if I hadn't been there, the thought was too much. When I reached the station, it felt alien. The building that had once been a refuge now felt small and fragile, incapable of holding the memories I was dragging behind me. My colleagues tried to talk to me, their voices filled with concern, but I brushed them off. What could I say? How could I explain the terror of looking into the eyes of a man who saw me as nothing more than prey? I sat down at my desk, the wick cool under my palms. My hands were still trembling. I stared at them for a moment, at the faint smudges of dried blood around my knuckles, and felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't my blood, nor was it entirely his. It was the forest's, spilled on its soil, soaked into its roots. I couldn't stay in the station. Grabbing my coat, I stepped outside again. The mountains loomed in the distance, their sheer cliffs cutting into the sky like jagged teeth. The valley below seemed tranquil, almost peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The trees, the rocks, the shadows, they all felt alive, as though they were holding secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. I walked aimlessly for hours, the crunch of my boots on the dirt path the only sound accompanying me. My thoughts spiraled, a chaotic mix of relief and guilt. I had survived, but at what cost? Eventually, I reached the edge of a small lake. The water was glassy and still, reflecting the sky above. I knelt down, cupping the icy water in my hands, and splashed it on my face. The cold was a jolt, pulling me back into the present. I stared at my reflection, at the face of someone who had been tested in ways he never imagined. I wanted to believe it was over, that John's capture meant the park was safe again. But deep down, I knew better. The forest had changed for me, and I had changed for it. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lake, I turned back toward the station. My mind kept circling the same thought. John wasn't the only predator out there. The wilderness is vast, untamed, and full of things we barely understand. For every John caught, how many others remain hidden? When I finally reached the station, dusk had fallen, and the familiar chill of the night crept in. The radio was silent now, but I could still hear echoes of his voice in my mind. I stood in the doorway, staring out into the endless darkness, my hand resting on the frame. The park was silent again, yes, but silence has its own voice, and tonight it was deafening. The frost on the morning grass glinted like tiny shards of glass, crunching beneath my boots as I made my way down the familiar trail. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint promise of winter. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the weight of my radio clipped to the strap a comforting presence. It had been weeks since the night, since I faced the darkness that had slithered into the heart of Yosemite. The scars on my hands had mostly healed, but they still ached in the cold, a physical reminder of John's twisted game. The mental scars, though, were more stubborn. Each tree seemed to whisper, every shadow seemed to shift. The park I once loved, its trails, its towering granite walls, its untamed beauty, now felt like a stranger. I wasn't sure if it had changed, or if I had. I walked slowly, deliberately, letting the rhythm of my steps guide me. The forest felt quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. Birds were silent, their usual chatter absent. I told myself it was the cold, the change of season. But deep down, a familiar unease prickled at the edges of my thoughts. I stopped at the edge of a clearing, the same clearing where John had quartered me weeks ago. The memory hit like a rush of icy water, his calm, mocking smile, the way his eyes gleamed with a predator's confidence. He had underestimated me, though. I wasn't his prey. I was the one who turned the tables, who made him feel fear for the first time. I had one. So why didn't it feel like a victory? I exhaled, my breath clouding the air, and skinned the tree limb. Nothing. Just the skeletal branches of oak swaying in the wind. My rational mind told me it was over. John was behind bars. His reign of terror ended. The park was safe again. But rationality didn't explain the footsteps I heard last night outside my cabin. I had told myself it was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer. I even convinced myself to sleep after double-checking the locks. But now, standing here, alone in the vastness of the wilderness, I wasn't so sure. The sound of footsteps, the deliberate crunch of weight on gravel, played over in my mind like a broken record. I shook my head, trying to brush off the paranoia. "Get a grip, man," I muttered under my breath, the sound of my own voice oddly comforting in the silence. I adjusted my pack and pressed on, following the curve of the trail as it descended toward the valley floor. That's when I heard it. A faint crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. It came from somewhere behind me, barely audible over the rustling leaves. I froze, heart hammering. I strained my ears, listening. The forest held its silence. It was nothing. A deer, maybe. Or the wind. Definitely not John. I kept walking, forcing myself to focus on the crunch of my boots, the weight of my steps. But the sound came again, closer this time. A deliberate, measured step. I spun around, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio on my shoulder. Calong? My voice cut through the stillness, carried off by the wind. No answer. Just the trees, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. I scanned the trail behind me, my eyes darting between the shadows. My breath quickened, clouding in the chill air. I gripped the radio, debating whether to call for backup, but I hesitated. What would I say? That I was hearing noises? That the forest felt wrong? They chalk it up to paranoia, tell me to take a few more weeks off. Another snap, this one so close it made me jump. My instincts kicked in. I stepped off the trail, crouching low behind a boulder. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scanned the woods, waiting, watching. And then I saw it. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing just beyond the clearing where the trees thickened. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. My stomach dropped. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I stayed rooted, frozen in place. John's in prison, I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. It's not him. It can't be him. The figure shifted, stepping forward into the dappled light. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw his face, those same cold, calculating eyes. But then the figure melted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I stayed crouched, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My rational mind warred with my instincts. Maybe it was just another hiker, I told myself. Maybe I imagined the face. But deep down, I knew better. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence, waiting for the sound of footsteps to fade. They never came. When I finally mustered the courage to move, my legs felt like lead, my body heavy with the weight of what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. I made my way back to the station as fast as I could, the forest closing in around me. Each snap of a branch, each rustle of leaves, set my heart racing. By the time I reached the safety of the ranger's office, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. I locked the door behind me and sat in the quiet, staring at the radio on the desk. The thought played in my mind over and over. Was it really John? Or was it someone or something else? I didn't call anyone. What would I say? Instead, I sat there in the growing darkness, the forest pressing in on all sides. And somewhere out there, beyond the safety of the walls, the footsteps waited. I still remember the crisp bite of the morning air as I stepped out of the ranger station, the sun just beginning to peek over the treetops. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and gold, and for a moment, the world felt impossibly serene. It was my first solo patrol, a rite of passage for every rookie park ranger, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nerves bubbling under my skin. The forest stretched out before me, vast and quiet, like a slumbering giant waiting to be explored. I adjusted my gear, patting down the essentials, radio, map, compass. I had triple-checked everything before leaving, but the nervous energy wouldn't let me stop fidgeting. You got this, I muttered under my breath, a small pep talk to steady my nerves. The older rangers always said this job was about confidence. The forest can smell fear, my mentor Dale had joked once, his grizzled face breaking into a rare smile. At the time, I laughed, but now, standing at the edge of the unknown, His words felt more like a warning. The trail started out well marked, a comfortable path winding through towering pines and moss-covered rocks. The earthy scent of damp soil and fallen leaves filled the air, grounding me. Birds chirped above, their melodies weaving through the rustle of the wind in the branches. It felt like the forest was alive, welcoming me, or so I thought. My task was simple enough: patrol the eastern quadrant of the park, a less frequented area known for its dense underbrush and tricky terrain. Dale had given me a detailed map, tracing the route with his finger while rattling off advice. Stick to the marked trails, and don't try to be a hero, he'd said, his tone firm. This place has a way of humbling you if you're not careful. I wasn't planning on being careless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was my chance to prove myself. I'd grown up idolizing people like Dale, rangers who seemed to carry the weight of the wilderness on their shoulders with ease. Now it was my turn, and I wanted to show I was cut from the same cloth. About an hour into the patrol, I started to relax. The forest was beautiful, almost hypnotic in its quiet majesty. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating patches of ferns and wildflowers. I paused to admire a small stream trickling over smooth stones. It sounded like a soothing whisper. Everything felt right. But as the morning wore on, I noticed the trail seemed less distinct. The dirt path narrowed, and the markers on the trees, small, painted blazes meant to guide me, became harder to spot. I pulled out the map, tracing my finger along the route. I should have reached a clearing by now, a checkpoint where the trail split into two loops. But there was no clearing, just more trees and an increasing sense of disorientation. This can't be right, I muttered, glancing around. The forest seemed denser here, the trees pressing in like silent spectators. I turned back the way I'd come, scanning for the last trail marker. Nothing. My pulse quickened as I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen one. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "You're fine," I said aloud, the sound of my own voice oddly comforting. I pulled out my compass and oriented myself, comparing it to the map. If I just kept heading east, I'd eventually find the main trail again. Simple enough. Right? I started walking, my boots crunching on the leaf-strewn ground. The sun climbed higher, its light dappling the forest floor, but the comforting chatter of birds had quieted. The silence was subtle at first, but it grew, a heavy blanket that seemed to smother the forest's usual symphony. Even my own footsteps felt muffled, as if the earth itself were absorbing the sound. An hour passed, then another. The unease I'd been trying to ignore crept closer, a shadow lingering at the edges of my thoughts. I stopped to drink from my water bottle, glancing at the map again. The more I looked at it, the less sense it made. None of the landmarks matched my surroundings. Had I taken a wrong turn? Or was the forest playing tricks on me? "Stay calm," I whispered, gripping the map tightly. But my confidence was unraveling. The forest no longer felt welcoming. It felt indifferent, vast, endless, and I was just a speck lost within it. As the afternoon wore on, I caught myself looking over my shoulder more often, though I couldn't say why. The trees stood still, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, but there was something about their silence that felt watchful. I shook my head, trying to banish the thought. It was just my imagination, I told myself, just the stress of being lost. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red, I knew I had to stop for the night. My legs ached, and my stomach growled in protest. I found a small clearing and set down my pack, forcing myself to focus on practicalities, building a small fire, rationing my food, and planning my next move. But as I sat there, staring into the flickering flames, the shadows beyond the firelight seemed to shift. The forest was alive, all right, but not in the way I'd imagined. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, the sound sharp and deliberate. My heart thudded in my chest as I strained to listen, the silence pressing in like a weight. And that's when I felt it for the first time, the unsettling sensation that I wasn't alone. I tightened the straps of my pack and glanced at the sun slipping lower in the sky. It was mid-afternoon, and I still had time to loop back to the main trail if I kept a steady pace. The map in my hand felt reassuringly crisp and authoritative, an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Yet something gnawed at the edges of my confidence, a quiet unease I refused to name. The shortcut seemed simple enough. I'd studied the forest's layout countless times during training, tracing the paths with my finger while my mentor, Ranger Hal, hovered over me like an overprotective parrot. "Don't underestimate this place, Nick," he'd warned. "The trails aren't just trails, they're lifelines. Stick to them." But the trail beneath my boots had narrowed, branches clawing at me as if to pull me deeper. I had a nagging feeling I'd veered off course, but the idea of backtracking felt like admitting defeat. This was supposed to be my moment to prove I could handle myself, to show I wasn't just some greenhorn kid fumbling in the woods. I paused, squinting at the map again. It wasn't matching up. The landmarks I expected, a cluster of pines by a shallow creek, weren't anywhere in sight. Instead, the terrain had shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. The trees seemed taller, denser, their limbs twisting together in ways that blocked out the fading sunlight. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint, damp smell that clung to my nostrils. I pressed on. The crunch of leaves underfoot was my only companion, a metronome to my growing unease. I told myself I'd find the trail again if I just kept moving forward. Every rookie ranger gets turned around at some point, right? No big deal. But the forest had other plans. The deeper I ventured, the more alien it felt. My surroundings blurred into a monotonous collage of bark and shadows. I'd look over my shoulder and swear I recognized a particular fallen log or an oddly shaped rock, only to realize I was imagining things. The forest played tricks, subtle ones, just enough to shake your footing without shoving you outright. The first real pang of doubt hit when I checked my compass. The needle jittered like it couldn't decide which way was north. I tapped it against my palm, muttering, "Come on, work with me here." It finally steadied, pointing in a direction that didn't match where I thought I'd come from. My stomach churned. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The rational part of my brain whispered excuses. Maybe the compass is fine, and I'm just disoriented. Maybe I didn't study the map closely enough. But the other part of me, the primal part, was louder. "You're lost." The light was fading faster now, the sky bruising into shades of purple and gray. I decided to cut my losses and retrace my steps. As I turned around, though, the trail I'd been following was gone. Or maybe it had never been there in the first place. The underbrush was thick and untouched, as if no one, not even me, had walked through it. A cold weight settled in my chest. I knelt and marked the base of a tree with my knife, a small X in the bark, a breadcrumb for a path I hoped would lead me back. The knife felt heavy in my hand, its polished blade reflecting the forest's dim light. The gesture calmed me, if only briefly. "Stay calm," I murmured, my voice breaking the silence. You got this. But the silence didn't feel empty. It pressed against my ears, thick and deliberate, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shivered and started walking again, trying to retrace my steps toward what I thought was north. Minutes turned into hours. Or maybe it just felt that way. Time was slippery here, distorted by the sameness of the trees and the sinking weight of my own panic. I checked the map again, but it might as well have been written in a language I didn't understand. The lines and symbols mocked me, their meaning unraveling with every glance. By the time I admitted I was truly lost, night was falling. The forest around me was changing again, the trees casting long, spindly shadows that reached for me like fingers. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a haunting, hollow sound that seemed far too close for comfort. I stopped and pulled out my radio, gripping it like a lifeline. Static crackled in response, hissing and spitting but refusing to form words. I tried again, pressing the button hard enough to hurt. Base, this is Nick. Do you copy? I'm off the trail. I repeat, I'm off the trail. Nothing. The static deepened, like the forest was swallowing my words. I stood there, holding the radio to my ear, until the silence became unbearable. I was alone. That realization hit me harder than I expected. I thought I knew what being alone felt like. I'd spent nights camping solo, had read books by firelight in the safety of my apartment. But this was different. This wasn't solitude. It was isolation, something darker and more absolute. The forest wasn't just a place anymore. It was a presence. And it wasn't friendly. As the last rays of light disappeared, I found a spot between two large rocks to hunker down for the night. I unrolled my emergency blanket, wrapped it tightly around me, and tried not to think about the shadows shifting just beyond my field of vision. I told myself I'd be fine, that I'd find my way out in the morning. But even as I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only thing awake in those woods. The light was fading fast, much faster than I expected. The towering trees above me seemed to conspire with the sky, pulling the blanket of dust down like a curtain. I had stopped walking hours ago. At least I thought it was hours. When it became clear I was just going in circles. The unfamiliar terrain mocked me with every step. I set up my meager camp with shaking hands. My radio crackled faintly, but no voices came through. Dead silence. My map, folded and refolded so many times it felt like an enemy itself, lay discarded on the ground beside me. Every direction seemed blonde now, every path alien. I tried to calm myself. You'll find the trail in the morning, I muttered, though my voice didn't carry much confidence. The sound of it in the stillness startled me more than I'd admit. The night descended fully, and with it came the cold. I sat with my back against a tree, knees tucked to my chest, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. It's being cut through the dark in a narrow cone, but the forest didn't care. Beyond the light's edge was an endless, impenetrable void, as if the trees themselves swallowed the glow. It was then I heard it, the sound, a rustling, faint but deliberate. My breath hitched. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. It was too rhythmic to be the wind and too heavy to be a squirrel or bird. I swept my flashlight in the direction of the sound, the beam slicing through the underbrush. Nothing. Only the trembling leaves and the distant outline of trees. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. Calm down, Nick, I whispered. It's just the forest. But my voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It was too thin, too fragile. I tried to ignore the way my heart pounded against my ribs. The rustling came again, this time closer. It was steady, purposeful, not the random scurrying of a wild animal. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I swept it in an arc, but it revealed nothing but shadows upon shadows. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by an oppressive silence that was somehow worse. And then I felt it. A sensation, not a sound this time, a weight. The unmistakable, primal feeling of being watched. My scalp prickled, and cold sweat beaded on my forehead. Every nerve screamed at me to look behind, but I was too terrified to move. My breath came shallow and quick, fogging the cold air in front of me. "How long?" I called out, my voice cracking in the stillness. Immediately, I regretted it. The word hung in the air, unanswered. When had I expected a friendly hiker to step out from the trees, waving and apologizing for scaring me? My own voice sounded ridiculous now, absurd against the weight of the silence. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The forest remained quiet, but the oppressive feeling didn't leave. I tried to rationalize it, running through the checklist of survival training I barely remembered. Could it be a mountain lion? No, mountain lions didn't rustle bushes like that. They didn't watch like this. Was it a person? Someone lost like me. Or worse, someone not lost, but hunting? My flashlight flickered, pulling me out of my spiraling thoughts. The beam dimmed for a moment, then came back, weaker now. My heart sank. I hadn't checked the batteries before leaving on patrol. Rookie mistake. Stupid. My survival now depended on a flashlight with a temperamental bulb. I tried to focus on my breathing, forcing it to slow. I reminded myself of the rules. Stay in one spot. Conserve energy. Don't let fear control you. But rules didn't account for the darkness pressing in or the feeling of invisible eyes boring into the back of my head. The rustling started again, this time behind me. My stomach dropped. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Slowly, as if afraid to provoke whatever was out there, I turned my head and aimed the flashlight behind me. The beam quivered as my hand shook, the light catching the tangled branches of the undergrowth. And there, just for a second, movement. A shadow darted between the trees, quick and low to the ground. My breath hitched again, my grip tightening on the flashlight. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. My own words felt hollow, useless. No answer came. Just the unyielding darkness and the oppressive quiet. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The rustling stopped eventually, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the movement again, felt the weight of whatever it was out there. I kept my flashlight on, though the beam grew weaker by the hour. When dawn finally broke, it didn't bring relief, only the realization that I'd survived my first night. But I wasn't alone in that forest. Something else was out there, and it wasn't done with me. Not yet. The morning came reluctantly, as if the forest itself wasn't ready to let go of the night. A pale, gray light filtered through the dense canopy, dim and lifeless, as though the sun had given up trying to reach me. I rubbed my eyes and stretched my stiff limbs, my body aching from the cold, damp ground. It had been a long night, filled with fragmented sleep and the persistent feeling that someone, or something, was just beyond the edges of my vision. As I packed up my gear, a chill prickled the back of my neck. The forest was unusually silent. No birds, no rustling of squirrels or scurrying of mice, just an oppressive, all-encompassing stillness. The silence felt wrong, like the world had hit pause, and I was the only thing left moving. I set off again, determined to find my way back. The map was useless now. I'd studied it endlessly last night by flashlight, and no matter how I turned it, the landmarks I passed didn't match. My radio, still crackling faintly with static, offered no help. Its signal was too weak to reach anyone, and I was too deep in the climb to higher ground. Then the fog rolled in. It wasn't a gradual creep, like the fog I'd seen in early morning patrols. This was sudden, swift, and thick, like someone had draped a heavy, gray curtain over the entire forest. Within minutes, the trees were little more than ghostly outlines, their trunks fading into the swirling mist. My breath quickened. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. Panic bubbled up, but I forced it down. "Keep moving," I muttered under my breath. "Stick to one direction, and you'll find something." I chose a direction, north, I thought, and began walking. Each step felt heavier, as though the fog itself resisted my progress. Every sound I made, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, seemed amplified, yet the forest around me stayed silent. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto something that didn't belong, an old campsite. At first, I thought it might be someone else out here, a lost hiker, perhaps, but as I stepped closer, my stomach twisted. The tent was tattered and half collapsed. Its once bright orange fabric faded to a dull, sickly brown. A rusted lantern lay tipped over near the entrance, its glass cracked and webbed with dirt. Nearby, an old camping stove sat on its side, blackened from use but long cold. I crouched by the fire pit, staring at the ashes. They weren't fresh. Whatever fire had burned here was long dead, but something about the scene felt recent. A half-eaten energy bar lay in the dirt, its wrapper torn but still shiny. A mug sat on a rock, filled with a murky liquid that might have been coffee once, now congealed into sludge. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, leaving behind everything but themselves. I should have left. Every fiber of my being told me to turn around and walk away, but I couldn't. I knelt by the tent, peering inside. The sleeping bag was still zipped up, neatly arranged, as if its owner had stepped out for a moment and never returned. A notebook lay beside it, its pages fluttering slightly in the faint breeze. I picked it up. The cover was water-stained, but the pages were mostly intact. The handwriting inside was rushed, uneven, like the person had been writing in a hurry or in fear. Day 3. Something's following me. I hear it at night, just beyond the camp. It doesn't come close, but it's fair. Watching. My hands trembled as I flipped to the next entry. Day 4. Tried to pack up and leave, but I keep ending up back here. The trails don't make sense. The forest isn't right. I saw something today. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human. I slammed the notebook shut and dropped it as if it burned me. My heart pounded in my chest. The air around me felt thicker, heavier, like the forest was pressing in closer. Was this some elaborate joke? Had someone planted this here to mess with me? Or was it real? The fog seemed to deepen, swirling around me, and for a moment, I swore I saw a shape in the mist, tall, thin, and unnatural. It disappeared as quickly as it appeared, leaving me frozen in place, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't linger. I grabbed my pack and ran, not caring which direction I went. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, bouncing back at me as though I were running through a narrow hallway. The fog swallowed everything, trees, sounds, even my own sense of reality. When I finally stopped, Out of breath and shaking, the campsite was gone. No matter how I turned or looked, I couldn't see it through the mist. It was as if it had never been there at all. I leaned against a tree, clutching the bark for support. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Was I losing it? Had the isolation and fear finally gotten to me? Or was there truly something in this forest, something that didn't want me to leave? I didn't have answers. All I knew was that the forest wasn't just a place anymore. It was a presence, a force, and it was watching. The morning was colder than I expected, a bone-deep chill that clung to my damp clothes and wouldn't let go. The sky above was a washed-out gray, and the sun, if it existed, was trapped somewhere beyond the dense canopy of towering pines. I had slept poorly, if you could call it sleep at all, half dozing in fits, waking to every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. My body was stiff, my throat dry, and my stomach gnawed at itself in protest. I forced myself to move, shaking off the lingering dread of the night. The map was useless now, a paper rectangle that mocked me with its precision and clarity, neither of which matched the reality of the forest. I folded it and shoved it back into my jacket pocket. I had no choice but to rely on instinct, a shaky and unwelcome substitute for proper navigation. The forest had changed overnight. Or maybe it was just me. The trails I thought I'd recognized yesterday now seemed foreign and twisted. The trees loomed larger, their trunks gnarled and ancient, as though they'd been here long before anyone ever thought to name this place. The air was heavy with a damp stillness, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots against the underbrush. Even the birds were silent, as if the forest itself had pressed pause on its usual rhythm. Then I heard it, a whistle. At first, I thought I had imagined it, a single, clear note that seemed to float through the air like a thread of silver. I froze, straining my ears against the silence. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a bird or the wind. It was deliberate, purposeful. A person. "Kalong?" I called, my voice cracking against the stillness. "Is someone there?" The silence returned, thicker now, like a wall closing in. I waited, holding my breath, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out everything else. Just as I was about to call again, the whistle came a third time. This time, it sounded closer, more distinct. It was coming from the north, or what I thought was north. I wasn't sure anymore. I pushed forward, adrenaline kicking my legs into motion. Whoever was out there, another ranger, a hiker, anyone, they might have a radio or know the way out. They could be my salvation. The thought gave me a renewed sense of purpose, cutting through the gnawing dread that had followed me since the first night. As I moved, the whistle grew louder, more frequent, guiding me like a beacon. But something about it nagged at me. There was no variation, no urgency in the sound, just the same single note over and over again. It felt wrong, as like it wasn't meant to signal help, but something else entirely. I told myself I was imagining things. Thunder and exhaustion were messing with my head. The forest had already played tricks on me. Shadows where there shouldn't have been, rustling with no visible source. This was no different. It was just a whistle. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn in, like a moth to a flame. The terrain grew rougher as I followed the sound. Roots snaked across the ground, and I tripped more than once, my palms stinging from catching myself on jagged rocks. The trees closed in tighter, their branches forming a tangled web overhead that blocked out what little light remained. The air was colder here, almost metallic, and the faint smell of damp earth gave way to something sharper, like iron. I paused to catch my breath, leaning against a tree trunk slick with moss. The whistle had stopped. For the first time since I began following it, there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just silence. Kalong? I called again, my voice trembling this time. It felt like a mistake the second the word left my mouth. The forest answered with another whistle, but this time, it wasn't ahead of me. It was behind. I spun around so fast, I nearly lost my balance. My eyes scanned the dense trees, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just endless trunks and shadows, stretching into infinity. The whistle came again, closer now, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't coming from any fixed direction. It was moving, circling me. A chill ran down my spine as the realization set in. I wasn't following the whistle. It was following me. Who's there? I demanded, my voice louder, sharper, as if sheer force could ward off whatever was out there. This isn't funny. Show yourself. No reply. Just a whistle, soft and almost mocking. I backed away, my boots crunching on dry leaves and snapping twigs. My pulse raced, my breath shallow and rapid. My fingers itched for the safety of the small pocket knife in my pack, but I knew it wouldn't do much against whatever this was. The whistle came again, this time so close that I swore it must have been just behind me. I turned sharply, ready to confront whoever, or whatever, was playing this game, but there was no one. Just more trees, their darkened forms leaning in like silent spectators. The forest had never felt so alive, or so hungry. I didn't wait for another sound. I ran, the pack on my back bouncing with each frantic step. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed for relief. The whistle didn't follow, or if it did, I couldn't hear it over the blood pounding in my ears. When I finally stopped, doubling over to catch my breath, the forest was silent again. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was charged, electric, like the pause before a thunderstorm. It felt like something was still there, watching, waiting. I didn't know what I had heard, or why it had led me in circles, but one thing was clear. I wasn't alone in the forest, and whatever was out there didn't want me to leave. The stream was a thin ribbon of silver threading through the endless green. It was my first real stroke of luck since I'd realized I was lost. My mouth was dry as sandpaper, my lips cracked and sore. I crouched by the water's edge, letting the icy flow splash over my trembling hands before cupping some to drink. It was shockingly cold, and I almost choked on the first swallow. For a moment, I just sat there, the water lapping against the rocks, the sound almost soothing. The world felt calm, ordinary even. A sharp contrast to the knot of unease I'd been carrying since nightfall the day before. I tried to convince myself that everything strange I'd experienced, the whispers, the footsteps, had a logical explanation. Animals, maybe, trickery of the wind, or more likely, my own fraying nerves. But then it happened. I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a flicker, a faint movement in my periphery. Something dark against the muted greens and browns of the forest. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and slowly turned my head. The trees stood still, their trunks like silent sentinels. Nothing moved, yet my skin prickled as though someone had just run their fingers down my spine. Kalong? I called out, my voice rough and shaky, breaking the stillness like a thrown rock into a pond. No answer. I told myself it was nothing. A bird, perhaps, or a branch swaying in a breeze too faint for me to feel. But I couldn't shake the sensation that something or someone was out there, just beyond my line of sight. Watching, waiting. I splashed some more water on my face, hoping to shake the feeling, and stood up. My legs felt weak beneath me, trembling more than they should have been. I took a deep breath and scanned the trees again, my gaze darting from trunk to trunk, looking for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. A shadow, deeper than the others, slid between two trees about 50 yards ahead of me. It was quick, too quick to be human, but too deliberate to be an animal. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as my heart began to hammer in my chest. The shadow was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the forest around me felt different now, heavier, like the air itself was closing in on me. I forced myself to move, telling myself I needed to keep walking, keep searching for a way out. But every step I took felt wrong, like I was walking into a trap I couldn't see. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I turned around, the forest stood still, silent, but the sensation of eyes boring into my back refused to fade. I picked up my pace, my boots crunching against the damp ground, my breath quickening. The faster I walked, the louder the forest seemed to become. Branches creaked, leaves rustled, and somewhere in the distance, something snapped like a twig underfoot. I spun around again, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. But the shadow was still with me. I didn't see it, not directly, but I felt it. Like a stain on the edge of my vision, something my mind refused to process fully. Every now and then, a flicker of movement would catch my eye, a ripple of darkness that didn't belong, darting behind a tree or vanishing into the underbrush. By the time the sun began to dip below the canopy, I was drenched in sweat despite the biting chill in the air. My breathing was shallow, ragged, and my body ached from tension. I found a fallen log and sat down, my legs finally giving out beneath me. My fingers fumbled with my pack, pulling out the small flashlight I'd brought. It was barely brighter than a candle, but it was all I had. I flicked it on, the weak beam cutting through the gathering gloom. The shadows seemed to scatter, momentarily retreating from the light. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. I kept the flashlight on, swinging it back and forth across the trees like a weapon. The forest was quiet now, too quiet. Even the rustling of leaves had stopped, as if the whole place was holding its breath. And then, from somewhere behind me, I heard it, a soft, deliberate rustle of leaves. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Every instinct of my body screamed at me to run, but I knew I wouldn't get far. Whatever was out there, it was faster than me. Smarter, maybe. It wanted me to run. I could feel it. So I sat there, gripping the flashlight like it was my lifeline, my eyes locked on the trees ahead. The rustling stopped, replaced by silence, so complete it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then I saw it again, just for a second. The shadow. It was closer this time, almost within arm's reach. A shade darker than the night itself, with no edges, no features, just a void where light should have been. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound that echoed through the trees, and scrambled to my feet. My legs were jelly, but adrenaline pushed me forward, stumbling blindly into the forest. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. Away from the shadow, away from the thing that wasn't supposed to exist. But the forest wouldn't let me go. It felt alive, twisting and shifting around me, leading me back into its depths. And somewhere behind me, I could feel the shadow following, its presence like a cold hand brushing against the back of my neck. I didn't stop running until I collapsed, my body giving out completely. By the time I hit the ground, the world around me was pitch black, the flashlight long gone from my grasp. And in the darkness, the shadow was waiting. The night wrapped around me like a suffocating shroud. The forest, which had once seemed so alive with rustling leaves and distant bird calls, was now oppressively still. Even the wind had abandoned me, leaving only the sound of my shallow, uneven breaths. I crouched under the twisted branches of an old cedar, clutching my flashlight like it was the only weapon I had against the suffocating darkness. The beam of light danced erratically across the forest floor, illuminating patches of damp leaves and gnarled roots. Every time it landed on a new shadow, my heart seized, convinced I had seen movement. But there was never anything there, just the forest, silent and unmoving, as though it were holding its breath. I leaned back against the tree trunk, my muscles aching from the day's relentless wandering. My body begged for rest, but my mind was a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. My stomach growled, a pitiful reminder of how long it had been since I'd eaten anything substantial. The protein bar I rationed earlier was long gone, and the hollow ache in my gut was joined by the bitter taste of dread. Then it started. At first, it was faint, a sound so soft I thought I had imagined it. A giggle, high-pitched and fleeting, carried through the trees. My head shot up, the flashlight beam darting wildly in the direction it came from. "Kalong?" I called, my voice cracking under the weight of exhaustion and terror. The sound of my own voice startled me, breaking the eerie silence. For a moment, there was no reply, just the oppressive quiet of the forest pressing down on me. And then, the laughter came again. This time, it was closer. It was the laugh of a child, light and playful, completely at odds with the darkness surrounding me. My pulse quickened as I rose to my feet, the flashlight trembling in my grip. "Is someone there?" I called again, louder this time, my voice echoing unnaturally in the still air. My mind raced. It couldn't be a child, not out here. No one should be here. But the sound was so unmistakable, so human, that a flicker of hope began to push its way through the fog of fear. I stumbled forward, drawn to the sound like a moth to a flame. My boots crunched on the damp forest floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. The flashlight's narrow beam barely penetrated the darkness, but I followed the laughter as it danced ahead of me, always just out of reach. "Wait!" I shouted, the desperation in my voice startling even me. "Please, stop!" The giggle stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I realized I was gripping the flashlight so tightly that my fingers were starting to cramp. Then, from somewhere behind me, a whisper. It wasn't words, not exactly. It was a soft, breathy sound, like someone exhaling directly into my ear. I spun around so fast that I nearly lost my balance, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness in a wild arc. My chest heaved as I searched for the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and trees, stretching endlessly into the night. The whisper came again, this time from my left. I whirled toward it, the light catching something, a flicker of movement, low to the ground. My breath hitched as I strained to see, but whatever it was had already disappeared. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. I felt the weight of the forest pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. The silence was no longer empty. It was alive, buzzing with a tension that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking uncontrollably. The ground beneath me felt uneven, shifting with every step. My back hit the cedar tree again, and I slid down to the ground, curling into myself like a child seeking comfort. The whispers turned to murmurs, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. They were soft and distinct, but undeniably human. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder, as though they were inside my head. "Stop," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please just stop." And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the voices were gone. The silence that followed was so absolute, so overwhelming, that it left my ears ringing. I slowly lowered my hands, my whole body trembling. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, huddled against the tree, staring into the darkness with unblinking eyes. The forest seemed to breathe around me, the shadows shifting and swaying like they were alive. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke, the sky above was streaked with the faintest hint of dawn, and the forest, for the moment, was still. The morning broke sluggishly, its light diffused to a gray sky heavy with mist. My body felt like lead, every muscle aching from the cold, hard ground. I had spent the night curled beneath a makeshift shelter of branches and leaves, though it offered little protection from the damp chill that seeped into my bones. Hunger clawed at my stomach, sharper now, like a predator sensing my vulnerability. I took a moment to gather myself, breathing deeply to fight off the dizziness. "You've got this, Nick," I muttered aloud, my voice weak but steadying. "Get up. Keep moving. Find your way out." It wasn't just a pep talk anymore. It was a lifeline, words tethering me to sanity in this vast, indifferent wilderness. I rose shakily, gripping my knife. It had become more than a tool. It was my talisman against the encroaching darkness, both literal and metaphorical. The decision to mark the trees had been a small victory of logic over fear. A system, a plan. I would carve a mark on each tree as I passed, a breadcrumb trail to guide me forward, or at the very least, to prevent me from walking in circles. I started walking, each step purposeful, ignoring the gnawing pain in my stomach and the dry rasp in my throat. The forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Even the birds seemed absent, their songs replaced by an oppressive silence that made the crunch of my boots on the undergrowth sound like gunshots. The first mark was clear, a diagonal slash carved into the rough bark of a fir tree. I touched it briefly, a strange sense of reassurance blooming in my chest. Evidence that I was making progress. Evidence that I wasn't going mad. But as the hours stretched on, the forest began to feel wrong. It wasn't something I could articulate at first, just a subtle shift, like stepping into a room where the air feels heavier. The trees grew denser, their branches tangling into a ceiling that blocked out the weak daylight. The trail underfoot faded into a web of roots and loose earth, as though nature itself was erasing my path. Still, I pressed on. I focused on my system. Mark a tree, move forward, find the next tree. It became a rhythm, a mantra, a way to drown out the rising tide of unease. Then I saw it. A tree with a mark. My mark. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The diagonal slash was unmistakable, the bark still raw from where I'd cut it earlier. But how? I'd been walking in a straight line, hadn't I? My breath came faster as I scanned the area, trying to worry of myself. Had I veered off course? double back somehow? I told myself it was a mistake, that I must have unknowingly turned around. Pay attention, Nick, I said aloud, the sound of my voice cutting through the suffocating silence. I chose a new direction, making sure to keep the sun, what little of it I could see, at my back. I walked for what felt like hours, leading a fresh series of marks along the way. The forest remained unchanging, a monotonous maze of trees and shadows. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted my movements. I tried to shake off the sensation, to focus on the next mark and the next. Then I saw it again. The same mark, the same tree. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I staggered backward, my eyes darting wildly, as if the trees might suddenly shift to reveal some hidden truth. I was sure this was the same tree, the same diagonal slash. I traced the cut with trembling fingers, feeling the jagged edges of bark, rough and familiar. It wasn't just a tree. It was a mockery, a reminder that I was trapped in something far bigger than my understanding. No, I whispered, shaking my head violently. No, this isn't real. My voice cracked, and I turned sharply, running blindly through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I needed to get away from that tree, from its quiet accusation. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, I looked around and felt my stomach drop. There it was, the same tree, the same mark. It loomed in front of me, its presence suffocating, mocking. I collapsed to my knees, my knife slipping from my hand and landing in the dirt. What do you want from me? I screamed into the void, my voice hoarse and desperate. The forest offered no answer, only the unrelenting silence. It was then that I realized the truth. This wasn't just a mistake or bad luck. The forest was alive. It was watching, waiting, and toying with me like a cat with a cornered mouse. I was trapped in its grip, a prisoner of something far older and crueler than I could comprehend. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my head in my hands, the weight of my situation crashing over me. I wanted to give up, to let the forest take me, but deep down, a stubborn flicker of defiance burned. I couldn't let it win, not yet. I picked up my knife, gripping it tightly, and stood. My legs trembled, but I forced them to move. One step, then another. I would keep walking. I would keep carving. Even if the forest twisted my path and stole my hope, I wouldn't stop. I couldn't. The forest might be alive, but so was I. And as long as that remained true, I wasn't finished yet. I don't know how long I'd been walking. The forest felt eternal, stretching into infinity, and I was nothing more than a speck caught in its endless maw. My legs moved on autopilot, dragging me forward, even as my mind screamed to stop, to rest, to just give in. But I couldn't, not yet. Not until I understood what this place wanted from me. The forest had grown unnervingly quiet. Even the rustling leaves and distant bird calls that had been my only companions were gone. Now, there was only the sound of my own labored breathing and the crunch of brittle leaves beneath my boots. Each step felt heavier, like the earth itself was trying to swallow me. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a tree, no different from the countless others I had passed. But as I got closer, my stomach clenched. There was something wrong about it. Something wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Its bark seemed darker, almost burned, and the air around it felt heavier, like stepping into a room where someone had just whispered your name. The carving was crude but unmistakable. A human-like figure, elongated and grotesque. with limbs too thin and a head that tapered into a sharp point. Its arms were stretched upward, as though reaching for something unseen, or perhaps beckoning someone closer. The lines were jagged, etched deep into the bark, as if the creator had carved with desperation or fury. I reached out to touch it, my fingers trembling, but stopped short. The air around the tree was colder, biting against my skin even though the rest of the forest remained untouched by wind or chill. A part of me whispered to turn back, to leave it alone, but my curiosity overpowered my fear. And then I noticed the ground. At the base of the tree, half hidden beneath a layer of leaves, was a small mound. It looked unnatural, disturbed. My first thought was that it was an animal's burrow, but as I crouched down, brushing the leaves aside, the reality hit me like a punch to the gut. Bones, small ones, brittle and yellowed with age. I recoiled, nearly falling backward, my breath caught in my throat. They weren't human, or at least, I told myself they weren't. They were too small, too fragmented. But there was something about the way they were arranged, almost deliberate, that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. My gaze snapped back to the carving, and suddenly it felt alive. Its elongated limbs seemed to writhe, just for a moment, as though it was twisting in the dim light. My head spun, my vision blurring, and I staggered to my feet. I couldn't stay here. Whatever this was, whoever had made it, it wasn't meant for me to find. And yet, as I stumbled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been meant to find it, that the forest had guided me here, that this grotesque figure and its macabre shrine were part of some larger game I didn't understand. I walked faster, almost running, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the image of the carving burned into my mind. Its jagged limbs, its outstretched arms, the silent promise of something darker waiting just out of sight. By the time I stopped, panting and disoriented, the forest had swallowed me again. The tree and its carving were gone, but the weight of it remained, pressing down on me like an invisible hand. I leaned against another tree, trying to steady my breathing, but the thought gnawed me. What if the carving wasn't just a warning? What if it was a marker? A sign of something that was still watching? Still waiting? I couldn't shake the thought as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me like grasping hands. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just lost. I was being hunted. I don't remember the moment I stopped walking. My legs, leaden with fatigue, simply refused to carry me further. I leaned against a tree, its bark rough against my hands, the only solid thing in a world that had become soft and blurred at the edges. My stomach groaned with an emptiness so deep it felt like it was devouring me from the inside. My tongue was thick in my mouth, dry as sandpaper, and my lids cracked with every breath. The forest around me seemed darker than it should have been, even though I could still see faint traces of daylight filtering through the canopy. Time had lost all meaning. Was it late afternoon, or just my mind playing tricks on me again? My watch had stopped working on the second day, and with it, my ability to track the hours. Days and nights had become an endless loop of confusion, fear, and exhaustion. I slid down the tree, my back scraping against the bark, and let myself sit in the damp, leaf-strewn dirt. My head lolled back, staring up at the towering trees that seemed to lean in closer, their tops whispering secrets to each other in a language I could almost understand but couldn't quite grasp. I closed my eyes, just for a moment, and that's when I heard her voice. Nick. It was soft, tender, like a lullaby. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering. My mother. It was my mother's voice. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline giving me the strength I hadn't felt in days. "Nan?" I croaked, my voice barely more than a rasp. "Mom, where are you?" No answer. Just the rustle of leaves and the ever-present hum of the forest. My chest heaved, and tears blurred my vision. It couldn't have been her. She was miles away, safe in her house, probably worried sick about me. But it had been her voice. I would have staked my life on it. "Kalong?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. "Is anyone there?" Then I heard laughter. Light, playful, and unmistakably human. A child's laugh. It danced on the wind, weaving through the trees like it was teasing me, daring me to follow. My heart screamed at me to stay put, but my legs had a mind of their own. I stumbled forward, my weakened body tripping over roots and rocks. Every instinct told me to stop, but desperation drowned out reason. Someone was here. Someone had to be here. The laughter grew fainter, pulling me deeper into the forest. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. "Wait!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Please don't go!" I don't know how long I chased the sound, but suddenly it was gone. The silence hit me like a wall, and I stopped dead in my tracks. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, giving sobs that shook my entire body. "What's happening to me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to squeeze out the chaos in my mind. The forest was messing with me, my body, my senses, my sanity. I was sure of it now. It wasn't just a place. It was alive, watching me, feeding on my fear. Then came the figures. At first, they were just shadows flitting at the edges of my vision. A flicker here, a shape there, always gone before I could turn my head. But then, as the shadows grew bolder, I started to see faces. Familiar faces. My mentor, standing beneath a tree, his eyes hollow and dark. My younger sister, her smile unnervingly wide. And my father, gone for 10 years, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Stop!" I screamed, clutching my head. "You're not real. You're not real." Their faces faded, replaced by the oppressive darkness of the forest. My breathing slowed, but my chest felt heavy, as if the air itself were trying to crush me. I wanted to lie down and give in, to let the forest take me. It would be so easy, so quiet. But then a voice cut through the fog of my despair. "Nick, keep going." It wasn't my mother's voice this time. It was my own, weak, trembling, but steady. Somewhere deep inside me, a part of me still wanted to live. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle screaming in protest. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't care. I just had to move. One step, another, and another. The forest didn't let up. It whispered, laughed, taunted me with memories and fears, but I shut it all out. My mind was a mess, my body broken. But as long as I could put one foot in front of the other, I was still alive. And that, for now, was enough. The morning came sluggishly, dragging the sunlight behind it like a reluctant child. My eyes opened to a cold, gray sky peeking through the tangled canopy, though I could barely feel the chill anymore. My body had stopped caring about discomfort. It had become a machine running on fumes, mindlessly moving because stopping meant surrender. I wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. I forced myself upright, muscles aching, my throat raw and parched. The water I'd drunk from the stream the day before wasn't enough. My head pounded with a dull, relentless rhythm, as if my brain were reminding me of its own fragile mortality. Every instinct in me screamed to lie back down, to let the forest have its way. But then I saw it, a faint trail cutting through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was another trick. The forest had played plenty already, looping paths, false landmarks, whispers in the dark. But this was different. The trail was faint, almost hidden, but deliberate. Flattened leaves and broken branches hinted at human passage. Maybe an animal's, maybe not. It didn't matter. It was something. And in a sea of nothing, something was a beacon. I pushed myself to my feet, legs trembling beneath me. Every step was an argument with gravity, a fight I wasn't sure I was winning. I followed the trail with cautious hope, marking trees with the tip of my knife as I moved. I wasn't going to let the forest trick me again. The air felt heavier as I walked, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. The silence was maddening, broken only by the occasional crackle of leaves beneath my boots. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if the forest had warned them away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by a person, not by an animal, but by the forest itself. Its trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Then came the wind. It started as a whisper, barely enough to rustle the leaves. But soon, it grew into a howl, swirling around me like a living thing. It wasn't natural. The wind didn't feel like wind. It felt like intent. It lashed at my face, flinging dirt and leaves into my eyes, blinding me. My markings disappeared in the chaos, the trail dissolving into a mass of indistinct shadows. "Stop it!" I shouted into the storm, my voice ragged and desperate. The forest, of course, didn't answer, but the wind did. It stopped, dead, just like that, as if it had been listening all along. I stood there, chest heaving, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. My ears rang in the sudden silence, but through the ringing came a sound, a faint, distant hum. It was low and steady, like the murmur of a river, but there was no water nearby. It was coming from somewhere ahead. I followed it, though every nerve in my body begged me not to. My legs moved of their own accord, a mechanical march toward whatever was calling me. The hum grew louder, resonating in my chest. It felt almost like music, but there was no melody, no rhythm, just sound. And then I saw it. The trail opened into a clearing. At its center stood a stone, a jagged, gray monolith, covered in moss and etched with patterns I couldn't understand. It hummed, faintly vibrating in the air. Around it, the ground was bare, the forest holding back as if afraid to touch it. The clearing was wrong. It felt untouched by time, unclaimed by nature. It didn't belong here or anywhere. I approached the stone slowly, every step a battle against an invisible force. The hum grew louder, filling my ears, my mind. My heart pounded, each beat screaming, "Turn back!" But I couldn't. I had to know. I had to see. When I reached it, I ran my fingers over the carvings. They were deep, precise, unlike anything I'd ever seen. Symbols that looked almost human but not quite. Figures with elongated limbs, eyes too large for their faces. And then I noticed the marks on the ground. Deep gouges in the dirt, like claw marks, encircling the stone. I staggered back, my mind reeling. The air around me seemed to shift, growing denser, darker. The hum turned into a low growl, a vibration that shook the ground beneath my feet. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing. I wasn't supposed to be here. I ran. The trail was still there, mercifully clear, and I followed it blindly, my feet pounding against the earth. The forest blurred around me, the shadows reaching out like hands trying to pull me back. The growl faded, replaced by the sound of my own frantic breathing and the rapid thud of my heartbeat. When I finally stopped, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. The trail stretched ahead, promising escape. For the first time in days, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. But even as I sat there, the image of the stone lingered in my mind, etched as deeply as the carvings on its surface. The forest wasn't just a place. It was something alive, and I had seen its heart. I can't remember the last time I ate. My stomach stopped growling days ago, replaced by a hollow ache that feels permanent now. The cold has burrowed into my bones, and my legs feel like dead weight. But none of that matters right now. All I can focus on is the sound. It started as a faint rustle behind me, the kind you dismiss as a squirrel or a gust of wind. But it's not stopping. Whatever is out there is keeping pace with me, mimicking my steps. When I stop, it stops. When I move, it follows. It's deliberate, too deliberate to be an animal. My pulse hammers in my ears as I press forward, clutching the knife I've been using to mark the trees. My makeshift trail feels useless now. I've lost count of how many times the marks disappeared, swallowed by the forest like they were never there. The knife isn't for marking anymore. It's for survival. The forest feels alive around me, shifting with each step. The trees loom taller, their gnarled branches curling inward as if conspiring to trap me. The air grows heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, like rust or blood. I know it's ridiculous, but I swear the forest is closing in. And then I hear it. A snap. Not the kind of snap a twig makes when you accidentally step on it. This one is louder, sharper, deliberate. I freeze mid-step, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned, knife trembling in my grip. Calon? My voice cracks, pathetic and small against the vast silence. Nothing. Just the endless rows of trees and the oppressive dark. But I feel it, the weight of something watching me. I take a cautious step backward, then another, my gaze darting between the shadows. And that's when I see it. A flicker of movement, so quick and faint I almost convince myself it's my imagination. But it's not. There's something out there. My body moves before my mind can catch up. I turn and run, the sound of my frantic footsteps tearing through the silence. The ground is uneven, roots and rocks clawing at my boots. I nearly fall more times than I can count, but I don't stop. The thing is behind me now. I don't know what it is, but I know it's chasing me. The rustling grows louder, closer, accompanied by a low, guttural sound that sends ice through my veins. It's not human. It can't be human. I weave through the trees, my breath ragged and shallow. The forest seems to shift around me, branches clawing at my clothes, my skin. It's as if the forest wants to slow me down, to hand me over to whatever's chasing me. My chest burns, my legs scream for rest, but I can't stop. Not now. Not when it feels like stopping will be the end. Then I see it, a faint trail ahead, barely visible through the gloom. It's different from the endless loops I've been trapped in. This one feels real, solid. I sprint toward it, every ounce of energy I have left fueling my legs. The sound behind me grows deafening, a chaotic blend of snapping branches and not inhuman growl. I don't dare look back. I don't want to see what's chasing me. The trail widens slightly, and I catch a glimpse of moonlight breaking through the canopy. Hope flares in my chest, fragile but enough to keep me moving. I'm so close now. I can feel it. Suddenly, something slams into me. A force so strong it sends me sprawling to the ground. My knife flies from my hand, landing somewhere in the underbrush. Pain radiates through my body as I scramble to my feet, wild eyes scanning the darkness. There's nothing there. No shadow. No figure. Just the sound of my own labored breathing and the echo of my fall. But I can feel it. Whatever it is, it's still there, lurking just beyond my vision. I stagger forward, legs barely holding me up, and push myself onto the trail. My vision blurs, and the world feels like it's tilting, but I keep going. I have to. And then I hear them, voices. Real voices. Human voices. Tears spring to my eyes as I call out, my voice hoarse and broken. The sound of footsteps, steady, purposeful footsteps, approaches from ahead. Flashlights cut through the dark, and I collapse to my knees, relief crashing over me like a wave. The last thing I see before everything fades to black are the rangers' faces, etched with a mix of shock and concern. I'm safe. For now. The world was slipping away from me, piece by piece. I had collapsed on a carpet of damp leaves, my body trembling from cold and exhaustion. My throat burned from thirst, my stomach churned from days without food, and my legs refused to carry me another step. I lay there, staring up at a sky fragmented by the dark web of tree branches, barely able to tell if it was day or night. It felt like the forest had won. The silence was unbearable, thick and pressing, like a weight on my chest. My ears strained for any sound, any hint of life, but the only noise was my own ragged breathing. Even the forest itself seemed to have gone still, as if holding its breath, waiting for me to finally give up. And maybe I would have, if not for the voices. At first, I thought they were another trick, just like the whispers and laughter that had tormented me these past days. But these voices were different, sharp, urgent, cutting through the suffocating quiet like a blade. "Over here," one called. A man's voice, deep and steady, but tinged with urgency. I blinked, unsure if I was dreaming. My head rolled to the side, and through my blurred vision, I thought I saw movement, real movement, not the fleeting shadows I've been chasing. It was too much to hope for. My lips parted, a hoarse sound clawing its way out of my throat, but it wasn't a word. I tried again, forcing air through my cracked lips. "Help!" It came out as a croak, barely audible. The voices grew louder, closer. A beam of light pierced the shadows, bouncing off the trees and glinting off the damp leaves around me. A flashlight. Real light. Not the ghostly glow of the moon or my failing imagination. I wanted to cry, but no tears came. My body was too dehydrated, too spent. "There! I see him!" Another voice yelled. Heavy footsteps thundered toward me, breaking branches and crunching leaves. I flinched, half expecting the forest to strike back, to snatch me away before they could reach me. But then hands were on me, strong, steady hands. Someone knelt beside me, and their face swam into view. "You're going to be okay," the man said. His face was weathered, his expression firm but kind. "We've got you." I didn't have the strength to reply. My head lolled forward, and I felt the scratchy fabric of a jacket draped over my shoulders. They were talking to each other now, rapid-fire words I couldn't fully process. "Pulse is weak. Dehydrated, maybe hypothermic. Radio in. Tell them we found him." I wanted to tell them everything. About the shadows, the whispers, the way the forest had twisted around me. trapping me in its endless loops. But my tongue felt like sandpaper, and my thoughts were a tangled mess. Instead, I let them lift me onto a stretcher. The sudden movement made my head swim, but I didn't care. For the first time in days, I felt safe. As they carried me through the forest, I closed my eyes, letting the sound of their voices wash over me. But even in my weakened state, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I forced my eyes open again, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but the oppressive weight of the forest's gaze lingered, as if it wasn't done with me yet. When we finally broke through the tree line, I saw the flashing lights of the rescue vehicle. Relief surged through me, but it was muted, as though part of me didn't believe I was truly free. The rescuers loaded me into the back, and the warmth of a blanket wrapped around me was almost too much to bear. My body shook uncontrollably, not from the cold anymore, but from the overwhelming realization that I had survived. As the vehicle rumbled to life, I glanced back toward the forest. The trees stood tall and silent, their dark shadows stretching toward me like fingers. I couldn't help but wonder, had I escaped, or had the forest simply let me go? I didn't know. All I knew was that something in those woods had tried to break me, and it had almost succeeded. I nosed. I woke up to the sterile hum of hospital machinery and the dull ache of my entire body. My eyelids felt like they were weighed down with lead, but I forced them open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. My throat was dry, my limbs heavy, and my stomach churned with a mix of hunger and nausea. For a few moments, I couldn't piece together where I was or how I got here. Then it hit me. The forest. My chest tightened, and I shot upright, the sudden movement sending a sharp pain through my ribs. The heart monitor beside me beat furiously in protest. A nurse appeared almost instantly, her footsteps soft but swift. She placed a hand on my shoulder, gently urging me to lie back down. "Easy now," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You're safe. You've been through a lot." Safe. The word felt foreign, almost laughable. I glanced around the room, noting the fore drip in my arm, the bandages on my hands, the thin hospital gown replacing my shredded uniform. My legs itched, the skin raw from days of trudging through brambles and undergrowth. "How?" My voice cracked, barely audible. I swallowed hard, trying again. "How long?" "5 days," she replied, her expression softening. "They found you 5 days after you went missing." 5 days. It felt like an eternity, and yet, in the silence of the forest, time had warped and stretched into something incomprehensible. 5 days of hunger gnawing at my insides, of cold that seeped into my bones, of something unseen watching my every move. 5 days of feeling like I was being unraveled from the inside out. The nurse left me to my thoughts, and soon after, a familiar face walked in. Greg, one of the senior rangers, entered the room with a cautious smile. He looked older than I remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite place. Relief, maybe? Or was it something else? "Nick," he said, pulling up a chair beside my bed, "you gave us a hell of a scare." I tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Sorry about that," I muttered, my voice still hoarse. "Guess I'm not cut out for solo patrols." He chuckled lightly, but to sound like humor. "You'll learn. The forest has a way of humbling all of us." The way he said it made my skin crawl, like there was more he wasn't saying. I shifted uncomfortably, the stiffness in my limbs reminding me of just how close I'd come to. I didn't even know what. Death? Madness? Something worse? What happened out there? I asked, my voice low. Did you see anything? Greg's jaw tightened. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. For a moment, he looked like he might brush off the question, but then his eyes met mine, and I saw something that made my stomach twist. Recognition. Nick, he began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not the first ranger to get lost in those woods. And you won't be the last. My mouth went dry. What are you saying? He hesitated, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. That part of the forest, it's different. People have gone missing there before. Some are found, like you. Some aren't. My mind raced, replaying the strange sounds, the shadows that seemed to move on their own, the laughter that couldn't have been real, but felt all too real in the moment. What is it? I pressed. What's out there? Greg shook his head, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know. No one does. But it's old. And it doesn't like us being there. The word sent a chill down my spine. It was vague, but it carried a weight that made the room feel smaller, the air heavier. Then why send anyone out there? I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. If you know it's dangerous, if you know people disappear, why keep going back? He sighed, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Because it's our job, Nick, to protect the forest, even the parts we don't understand, and to protect people like you from it. I didn't know what to say. A part of me wanted to call him out, to demand answers, but another part, the part that had spent 5 days in that endless, suffocating labyrinth, knew better. There were no answers, not ones that made sense anyway. Greg stood, placing a hand on my shoulder. Get some rest. You'll need it. Greg, I said quickly, stopping him before he could leave. The things I saw, the sound I heard, were they real? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Pity, maybe, or understanding. Real enough, he said finally, and then he was gone. I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling as his words echoed in my mind. Real enough. I thought of the carvings, the bones, the whispers that still lingered at the edge of my memory. The forest hadn't just been a place, it had been a presence, alive and aware. Safe, the nurse had said. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something behind in that forest. Or maybe it had lost something in me. I woke to the stereo hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of antiseptic. The room was cold, unnaturally so, but not nearly as cold as the forest had been. My body ached in ways I didn't know it could. Every muscle felt stretched too thin, my ribs protested with each shallow breath, and my hands, when I raised them to my face, trembled as if they belonged to someone else. I was alive. Somehow, I was alive. The first face I recognized was Ranger Cooper's. He was older than me, his face weathered by years spent out in the wilderness, his gray-streaked beard moving slightly as he chewed on his lip. When he noticed I was awake, relief washed over him, softening his hard features. "Ned," he said, his voice gravelly but warm, "you gave us one hell of a scare." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw and dry. He handed me a cup of water, and I drank it greedily. The simple act of swallowing felt like a victory. "Calm," I managed to croak. "We found you just in time," Cooper said, leaning forward in his chair. "Another hour or two, and you wouldn't have made it. You were near a trail, One that shouldn't have been where you were, to be honest. But we heard your distress call. Static mostly, but enough to trace. The words didn't make sense. I hadn't used my radio in days. The batteries had died long before the whisper started. I stared at him, trying to piece it together, but my memories felt fragmented, like shards of glass scattered across a dark floor. Did you see anything? I asked, my voice shaking. Out there? Cooper hesitated. His eyes darted to the window, then back to me. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. Nick, I've been doing this job a long time. Long enough to know that some places aren't just wilderness. There's something else. Something old. You're not the first to get lost out there, but you're one of the few who came back. My skin prickled. What do you mean? He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. We'd had stories, people hearing things, seeing things that shouldn't be there. Hell, even I felt it. Like the forest is, alive in a way it shouldn't be. It plays tricks, Nick, and it doesn't let everyone go. I thought of the carvings on the tree, the bones half buried beneath it, the laughter in the dark, the way the forest seemed to breathe around me, its branches closing like hands over prey. I shivered. What about the carvings? I asked. And the bones? Cooper's brow furrowed. What carvings? What bones? I froze. They were there, I insisted. I saw them. Easy, Cooper interrupted, his hand on my arm. You've been through a lot. Sometimes, the mind plays tricks when you're pushed to the edge. But his words rang hollow. The look in his eyes said he didn't believe that any more than I did. Days later, they let me leave the hospital. My body was healing, but my mind? That was another story. The forest clung to me in ways I couldn't shake. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves outside my window at night dragged me back there. To the whispers, to the eyes I never saw but always felt. I tried to go back to normal life, but something inside me had changed. I found myself staring at maps of the forest, tracing the paths I'd walked, or thought I'd walked. My knife marks had vanished. The trail where they found me wasn't marked on any map. It wasn't just me either. The other rangers avoided the topic whenever I brought it up. You made it out, they'd say. That's all that matters. But the way they said it, their voices tied with something close to fear, made it clear they knew more than they let on. One night, I dreamed of the carving. The elongated figure, its limbs twisted and wrong. In the dream, it turned to look at me, its hollow eyes meeting mine. I woke up gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there with me wasn't finished, that I'd left a part of myself behind in that forest, and maybe brought something back with me. Even now, as I write this, I feel it. A weight in the room, just out of sight. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until you can't take it anymore. I thought about going back, about finding the place where it all happened, but some part of me knows I wouldn't return a second time. Some places are meant to be understood. Some questions are better left unanswered. And some forests don't let you leave without keeping a piece of you.